Let's try again. I have to click going live. All right, everyone. We thought we were going live before. Maybe we're going live right now. Hopefully we're live now. I'm Carter. We are... Yes, we are live. Okay, good. That's working. I'm Carter. We are doing the Unsafe Space book club today. We have, I think, the smallest book club audience that we have ever had, which I will admit is a little bit disappointing to me because I thought it was an awesome book. But, hey, you guys can't hang with some good writing. I don't know what to tell you. But Alex and Keith can. Alex and Keith, hi. Thanks for joining. We are responsible for an awesome discussion, all three of us, today. So, let me start by asking you guys, did this change your opinion of anarchy at all? Are you guys muted again? I don't know why.
Central governments never learned their lesson. I was still unable to mute because of the central authority.
Oh, there was some allow panelists to unmute themselves button that wasn't clicked. Sorry about that. So you guys should be fine from now on. Yeah, did this change your opinion about anarchy at all?
No.
No?
I'm sorry to break your heart, Carter, but I did not like this book.
You cannot like the book. That's fine.
I kept saying this. I kept feeling it while I was reading it. I was like, the dumbest smart people I've ever read. That's where I was throughout most of it. Because here's the thing, is that I'm not okay with anarchy, and I'm not okay with overreaching government. I want something in the middle. And which is how I am with most things. I want something in the middle, not like full-blown one way or full-blown the other way, because I feel like that's always going to result in problems for people on a massive scale.
Did you go in thinking one thing about anarchy and coming out the end, or you just came in like, and didn't it change your opinion about anarchist thinkers at all?
Well, I mean, I'd read some anarchist thinkers before, but for my mind, I'm like, what are your arguments for this? And because I read a lot of argumentative essays, and I even taught argumentative essays and everything. And so I didn't go into it like with a major thing of like, I'm going to hate this. Like, I gave them a chance to convince me, and some of the points I agreed with them on, but the conclusions they came to or the assumptions they started from were where I had a problem. Like, I know you mentioned you like this Spooner thing, but he says of the Constitution, it purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago. And I'm like, that's not what it is. That's a bad assumption to start from on what the Constitution is. It's not a contract, not with people. And so I'm like, immediately, I'm like, you've gotten something wrong.
Well, I think he was responding to the social contract argument, which is often what's used to justify government, right? So there's context there. But, I mean, it's weird because I really appreciate radical thinkers, even if I disagree with them. So, like, I had trouble slogging, like, everyone knows already I'm an ANCAP, so like the anarchy part was fine with me, but I had trouble struggling through some of the communist stuff and the bad economics. And even though I had trouble struggling through it, and like you, I was identifying, at least for this part, like, oh, these are some bad premises and some bad conclusions or whatever. It's still refreshing to hear. I think it's refreshing to hear someone who's coming at it from like a completely different angle. And like, I'm looking at society, I'm stepping outside of what we have now. I'm not stuck in where we are now, and I'm trying to address problems kind of with a clean slate. So I appreciate even that, but yeah, I don't know. What about you, Keith? Did it change your opinion about anything?
It helped me understand aspects of anarchy and some of the more common problems. I haven't read very much about it, and I don't consider myself an anarchist, but my entire political and how to arrange society thinking since, I don't know, probably by around 20 or 22 or so, I was pretty much libertarian. So ever since then, the most interesting or the only interesting arguments to me about government are how far to go from like small L libertarian to anarchy. Like I'm somewhere in that line, and I just slowly moved closer and closer to anarchy. So I don't know where I'm at. I'm like small L libertarian to me is way too much government now, but I'm not quite anarchist.
It was
so-
someone who said, was it David Friedman, I think, who was saying, like, because this is kind of where I am, where he was like, let's push to get, he couldn't solve the national defense issue cleanly, or at least he felt like he didn't have a good answer for the national defense issue, and he was like, okay, well, let's get to the point where that's all we have, and then we'll see. And that's been kind of my strategy with anarchy generally anyway, is kind of like, let's just start replacing stuff, and once we see that it's working, then we look at the next thing to replace, and like, I think that will work forever, and we can replace everything. But you don't have to agree with me to take the first step down that path, right?
And he spent his chapter, David Friedman's chapter in the book, was half of it was on how to do national defense. And
Yeah.
he's picking the two biggest problems. So, you know, the libertarian 101 is, well, who will build the roads? Well, that one's pretty easy, right? You don't have to think about it too much to figure out the roads part. But yeah, national defense, that's a big problem. And the other part that he went into, which I've never gotten a good handle on it thoroughly, is courts. How do you do courts and that sort of thing? And he had a powerful argument for how to do that. So that was one I was never real sure about. And there's a couple people in this address that to my satisfaction. The national defense one I still think is a tough one. But you see countries that don't have defense, you know, Switzerland, like how come North Korea doesn't want to attack Switzerland? Like they're not sending, you know, the Middle East, Switzerland doesn't need to send troops to Afghanistan because terrorists are going to bomb. Nobody really wants to go after them. So that's worth thinking about. You know, the argument that was presented in there by a couple people, I don't remember who, but that a country that doesn't go out and attack people, how many people really will want to take it over? May not be as big of a problem as people seem to think. The reason a country like US needs a huge military, one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons is because we've got military bases in 100 countries, and we're bombing a dozen or so right now. Yeah, a lot of people have a problem with this. So like we need it's like we need a big military because we have a big military. Is that really the reason? That might be the primary reason. So the idea that you can back that off to something much smaller and not have a standing army, that's a powerful argument. So to answer your question,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna, I'm not sure if I actually answered your question,
Maybe not.
which is, I understand it better, and I'm more comfortable with moving closer to that line, I think. So I guess minarchist is a word to hear people throw around. I guess I'm a minarchist, but some people think like libertarian is minarchist too. That to me, mainstream libertarian is too much government, in my opinion.
What about you, Cheeky Mare? What was your reaction?
I liked the book. I didn't read all of it. I skipped chapters. Can you hear me? I'm at work, so I can't do video. So I around to the different chapters, and having the thinking through the thought process and having those different perspectives to think about was definitely probably pushing me towards the minarchist. But I'm like you. I think we would have to do it piecemeal. We couldn't just go from where we are now to, all right, no rules, no government. So if we could baby step towards it, I'd be all for that. My brother is part of a Republican group, and I've been kind of feeding him little libertarian principles. And so it just gave me a few more principles to kind of feed him and get him to think about. So it was definitely a good read. I mean, it was hard. I have a reading disability, so the old timey language was hard for me, but I got through most of it, so I liked it.
Keith, there was one part in particular that I was thinking about you, and I don't remember who it was. Was it Spooner that was talking about the? I think it was Spooner that was talking about the American. I was going to say Civil War.
Constitution.
You'll smack me if I say the word Civil War.
The War of Northern Aggression.
What do you call it?
Well, I prefer to call it the War for Southern Independence.
War for Southern Independence. Was it Spooner that was talking about that a lot?
Yeah, in fact, his article was written in 1870 about. So yeah, it's just after. And Lysander Spooner, for people who don't know, he was an attorney and an abolitionist who basically, I think he supported the South seceding. Like, that's what his story is. It's a move towards independent government. Go ahead, anyway. It probably was him, but say it.
Yeah, no, it was. He didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Lincoln. He certainly felt like it was an expediency was the reason why, or kind of doing this, the political wind was the reason why any slaves were freed, and that it wasn't really a move towards freedom. The Civil War, which I think, or the War of Southern Independence. I don't know. I just thought of you as I was reading that because I know that it's a topic that you're interested in particular, and his characterization of it. So I like reading people who are contemporary like who are writing contemporaneously about events, even though they have their biases, and I'm sure he obviously has his biases. It's not filtered through the lens of what's been the accepted historical narrative. It's biased, but it's kind of more raw. Like, this is what's happening right now, and I'm responding to it. So that was one of the things that I enjoyed about that. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on Spooner's.
Yeah, I enjoyed his, and it's a bit of a slog. Cheeky Merrick, he said, if to read something that an attorney in 1870 was writing, and he's long-winded. He makes his point like over and over and over and over. I was interested in, I never heard a lot of what he was talking about. I've never read him. I know who he is, but yeah, he made the point basically about independent government. He went into some detail about why the South seceded and why they had the right to do that. So for those arguing that people have the right to self-determination and to set up their own government, which is basically the argument of the Declaration of Independence, you have to say that the South had the right to secede. Of course they do. If you believe that the revolution, the American War for Independence, that we were allowed to secede from England, then you have to say the South can secede from the United States. It's the same question, and he presented that really well. So I'd recommend that chapter. People just want to read pieces of this. And if anyone wants to read the book, it is a big book and it's dense, but it's a whole bunch of articles from all different people, starting from, I don't know, 1600s or something, 1700s up till now. Yeah. So you can just read pieces of it. It's not necessary to read the whole thing. And I didn't finish it. I'd like to finish it. But, anyway, Spooner, he went into the reason for the South seceding and supported it, basically, presented the reason for why. So people who think they understand, that Lincoln was a good guy and wanted to keep the Union together, that's a bunch of, that's the reason wasn't slavery. And I already knew that. I've read a lot about that, but Lincoln picked up on the slavery thing partway through the war because he realized it had a lot of political advantages. But he didn't care about getting rid of slavery. He would have let the South back in and kept slavery forever. I don't know, I think Spooner made that point, or somewhere else I've read it, like there was a 13th Amendment was proposed. I don't know how many people know what the original 13th Amendment was, but it was going to make slavery legal in certain states in perpetuity and put it in the Constitution. Like Lincoln would have gone for that. It's kind of ironic. That would have been the 13th Amendment if we let Lincoln write it. The one we have is actually the opposite of that. But it's interesting for people who are following that. If you want to read a description of why the South seceded by an attorney and an abolitionist written in 1870, like that's an interesting view. That's better than reading the Black Lives Matter view. I like this part, and the Constitution part too. I don't really want to get into that, but that was fascinating. I never even heard that argument about. I'm going to switch to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of ties back into what Alex was saying, though. So I want to pull Alex back in a little bit and say, so what were some of were there any arguments that you hadn't heard before, or were they all like, yeah, I've heard all this stuff before?
I mean, most of it was new to me. It was just that I felt like a lot of the times the argument could have gone either way on a conclusion. It could have. The one that actually drove me crazy the most probably was the Morris and Linda Tannehill, The Market for Liberty, which is an incredibly long one because it talked about privatizing the court system and justice. And that really drove me nuts because I was like, we've seen like Pinkertons and I'm like, is this how you want, do you want a cyberpunk dystopia? Because this is how you get a cyberpunk dystopia. The idea that everything is privatized. I was like, it's not actually going, here's my problem. So I think it's naive to entirely trust the internet, the government to do everything for you, to always have your best interest at heart. Absolutely 100% true, because it's made up of people. I also think it's naive to have that same trust in private organizations. I don't think they also have your complete trust in you, that they're your complete interest at their heart, because they're also still just people. And I think any organization, whether it's state or private or charity or whatever, will eventually only exist to promote its own internal goals for the people at the top. So
do you think that's not what they're saying? Because I think they would agree with that, and they would say yes, but then you have competition, which you don't have in the case of government, and you do have in the case of like if you have, I think they mentioned like thousands of, or maybe it wasn't them, maybe it was Friedman who mentioned thousands of these organizations. Like competition keeps them in check, right? Like so, Apple as Apple's become more of a monopoly, I think their customer service has gotten worse. Like, and Comcast is really horrible. But if you go to an industry where there's lots of competition, you generally get much better customer service. Just
I agree with that. I agree with that, except for the fact that I am pro antitrust, and that doesn't come from a private organization. And I've also seen industries self-regulate to the point where they protect each other. So, for example, the video game industry, for a good example, they have their ratings, their ESRB ratings. They make that up themselves. There's no one else. That's not.
Why do you think they make it up themselves?
So that they can sell the best to the widest audience. So like an 18+ game will not sell.
I have a theory about why they make it up, though. I don't. Maybe I'm wrong, but I know why the MPAA does it.
Why?
They did it to prevent the government from doing it. The government talked about doing it, and they were like, no, we'll self-regulate. So they did it because they were afraid of the government doing a worse job. I don't know if that's true for games, but I certainly remember the Tipper Gore era of like, and the era of like, hey, let's regulate all this stuff that kids are consuming. I don't know anything about the video game industry, so maybe that has nothing to do with why they're doing it. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, to me, the idea is, though, even with your example, the threat of the government regulation was there that made them do it. If the government was not there at all, would they have done it? Probably not.
Well, but you're complaining that they're doing it poorly, so that's so good.
Well, I don't know about movie in that rating, but I can tell you the problem with the video game industry, why their self-regulation is bad, is because they won't make anything 18+ that includes gambling mechanics, which then it's being sold to minors. That's why I say that internal industry regulation is bad.
Well, gambling is something though has legal significance and is regulated by the state, and right. So there's a precedent for gambling being treated differently. right? That's
and
not
the government's
unrelated
not
to the
doing
government.
it.
Well,
That's
the
my
government
problem, is that
does do
they're
it, though.
like, when the government doesn't do their job, I have a problem with them, but when they do it badly, I also still have a problem with them. Like, it's not that I'm like, yes, government, get involved every time. It's just that I don't think that industries will regulate for the good of the people or their employees
They won't.
either.
They'll regulate for profit. They will regulate to make the best money.
They'll
So I
regulate
think
for profit for now, but they won't regulate for profit for the long term, even,
good
because they
ones
will
will.
fail themselves.
Good ones will. No, good ones will. There's plenty of examples. Like, there's a reason why people like. I mean, I'm not saying this guy's the best example ever, but he's the most recent I can think of. There's a reason why people like Elon Musk are like, I don't do earnings calls because I don't want to be driven by the quarterly cycle of having to tell you, like, I don't want to be driven by quarterly stock prices, right? Warren Buffett is kind of famously not driven by that either, and also very long-term thinker. Like, good ones will, right? I mean, I think the whole focus on short-term profit, not to throw government in again, but the whole focus on short-term profit is largely a result of regulations on private markets and the fact that we have the way private markets are run, or not private markets, public markets are run, is very much controlled by the government, and we have quarterly earnings and all this kind of crap, and this is part of an apparatus that I'm not sure would evolve naturally on its own. Something would evolve, but I'm not sure it would be that, right? Maybe I'm wrong. I think something that I can agree with you on, though, which I think, I don't remember who mentioned this, which author talked about this, but I got this theme, I think, from a few different authors, that there's kind of an underlying need to have a culture support. I guess the one that I can think about the most is the last author, whose name I forget. Hold on. The guy who
Michael
talked about
Malice.
the courts.
Yeah, Michael Malice.
No, not Michael. John, yeah, not Michael. John Hasnas, the attorney. His argument that the law is never objective, which, by the way, I had never heard. I had never really heard that. I thought it was really interesting. But I was kind of getting this sense from him, like, look, the law is going to be whatever kind of the culture of over time pushes the law to be. Like, people are going to interpret it based on their own biases and their own ideology, and if ideology of the judges changes over time, then that's how the law will be interpreted. And it seems to me, and this is one of the reasons why, while I might be excited about, like, pressing the reset button tomorrow and having complete anarchy politically, one of the things that I think is a prerequisite is a culture that, like, respects some of the ideas of individualism first, because otherwise you end up with a culture that's pretty horrible. So I don't think there's anything about anarchy or the free market generally, even if it's a regulated free market, I don't think there's anything about that tells you that you get good ESRB ratings. I think what it tells you is you get ratings that the market supports, and that's what people support. I mean, if it's free, you get what people want, and what they want isn't always, quote, good, right? It's just what they want.
I don't know, maybe you don't know how many people are mad about the ESRB ratings, because it's quite a bit.
Sure, but it's either happening because it's what people want, all things considered, or there's externalities probably involving other dynamics that we don't see. That's like why they're doing that, right? They're not just doing it because they want to sabotage their own business. Like, they're not doing it out of malice.
Has anybody else ever started a competing voluntary rating system?
There are rating systems in other countries, mostly. I know the UK has their PEGI one, but I don't know if that one's state or industry based.
What do you think the weakest argument from all of the authors in the book was for anarchy, Alex?
The assumption that the Constitution is a contract with people. It's like, it's not a contract, and it's not about the people so much as it is about limit on the government. And that was my
It
problem.
is a contract.
What do you think
It is a
If it's
contract.
not a contract, what is it?
It's not. What do you consider a contract? How do you, it's something that people negotiate and argue for to stand for a certain amount of time under certain instances. But the idea is that a contract is, it's about if you don't apply it to that idea that these people had to argue for it, and if you want to look at it from a private standpoint, then maybe it could be a contract with the organization of the federal government, but it is not with itself only, not with anyone else, because the contract is essentially that they won't do these things. And
right.
As a government, not as a people. That's the problem. You keep bringing up the idea that it's between people, and I'm like, it's not between people.
That's not his idea, though. He's debunking it. He's agreeing with you that it's not a contract. He's arguing against the people who say it's a contract, because that's where the validity comes from morally. So he's saying it's not a contract at all. He's agreeing with you. But if it's not a contract, then what is it, and why do we have to follow it? I think you could actually argue it's a contract between states, because it was ratified between states. Like you could actually maybe make that argument, but he didn't get into that. But let's put that aside for a second. I think he would agree that it's not a contract. So what is it, and why does it bind me, for example? If it's not a contract, why do I care what's written on the piece of paper?
It doesn't bind you. It binds the federal government.
Well, but it does bind me, because certainly the federal government binds me. Like I can't, for example, disobey a law and expect no consequences. Like I am subject to their jurisdiction.
Well, those laws are not listed in the Constitution. We're talking, like, if you're talking about the Bill of Rights specifically, then that is not about you not murdering someone, which is a law that is separate from the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Yes, exactly. So that is not what's binding you.
So what would you say? How would you say the Constitution is what then?
It is a limit, a list of limits for the federal government.
So, but is it enforceable at all? By whom? Like, for who promises to limit it, and who can enforce it? Like, who's it a promise to?
I would say it is a promise to the people, but at the same time, it's basically a limit by the federal government for the federal government. They're supposed to enforce it themselves upon themselves. And
so you sound like you're supporting him. Like you sound like Lysander Spooner right now, or whomever. What's the difference between what you're saying and what he's saying then?
Let me look at what he wrote.
Okay.
That was a really long one, by the way.
It was.
I got stuck on the one with the rights thing. This is your right, and he said rights about 47,000 times.
Oh, yeah, that one.
I got stuck on that one, so I started flipping around. I think it was chapter 4.
He needed an editor. I would like to.
Yeah.
His editor cut that down to like 10%. But anyway, go ahead. I think you are agreeing with him, Alex. And I didn't agree with him, by the way.
Okay, while Alex is looking it up, Keith, you didn't agree with him. What do you think the Constitution is?
Well, I look at it as compact is the legal word that's normally used. It's a compact, which is a legal agreement between states, between government bodies. So his point was that there's no such thing as that. You can only have a contract with a person. So I think I would like to see him address it. Like I would like to be there and say, well, what about a compact? Like, it's not a contract. No one ever said it was a contract. Contract is the word that's often used with people, general people, you just say, what is it? It's a contract. It's actually really a compact, which is a contract between states, if you want to use the word contract.
I thought
The federal
makeup thing.
government's not a, what?
I thought it was a makeup thing, a compact. I'm being funny, sorry.
I mean, Keith, maybe he would have made his life
I didn't
easier.
know your switch.
Maybe he confused things by using the Constitution of the United States, because like I said earlier, I think you can make that argument, like this is an agreement between states, because it is ratified by states. Now you could also make the argument then that states don't exist and blah blah blah, but he could have maybe picked on a particular state's constitution and made this argument about the state's constitution not being contract.
That would be easier, I think, to do. Yeah, that's a good idea. That didn't occur to me. But I would have wanted to ask him, is it possible for a group of people to make an agreement that binds them? He said no. I think that's what I would summarize his like 300-page diatribe on this whole thing. He's saying that, you know, the president has no obligation to anybody because they didn't issue their oath to anyone. He doesn't, you know, corporations wouldn't count. Like, no group can ever make an agreement.
No,
that's kind of where he starts from, right?
Could. No, but a corporation, everyone in the corporation agrees, so it's unanimous, and they can make an agreement within, like, you can have groups make agreements, but you can't have groups bind people who don't agree, and you can't have groups bind their progeny. Like, you can't have offspring bound, like people who weren't born bound by it. So I think his argument is, if it was a unanimous thing that this group of people unanimously agreed, that's yes, we want to be bound by it, and this group of people unanimously agreed we want to be bound by it, and they signed an agreement between each other, like, I don't think he would argue that can't happen. I think he's arguing that's nothing like any law in the U.S. or any compact or constitution.
On what the Constitution was. Okay.
I think the problem, though, is that he acts, I think, in like any organization is by law considered an entity, whether it's private or state, and can enter into contracts. That includes the federal government. They make contracts all the time. And
well,
so,
but he's not talking about legal, he's talking about morally, right? And so morally in a yes, if I have a company, I can make a contract, but you don't have to be part of my company. You voluntarily are part of my company, knowing that I have power to make contracts that bind potentially you. You can leave. Like, it's all voluntary. You're not. I can't start a company and have you not be a part of it at all and say I don't want to be part of this company, and then go bind you by contractually obligating the company to do things and say, well, sorry, Alex is part of my company. I don't care that you didn't want to be part of my company. You are. Like, and that there's a fundamental difference between between governments and private organizations, right?
but I can leave the country too.
Well, that's not relevant, right? Like, that argument is not relevant. Like, you're just sitting there doing your thing. Like, yes, but you can't actually leave the country and go anywhere on Earth where someone doesn't say that they speak for you and bind you to contracts. So we're not talking about. He's talking about ethically, like he's talking about philosophically and morally. Can you be bound by? Can party C be bound by an agreement between party A and B? Right? And you can't just say, well, party C could move if they don't like being bound by A and B. Well, that's they should be able to be in a coma and not do anything and not get affected. Like, they're not bothering anyone. They're just doing their thing, and that's his moral argument, right? So where does the right of A and B come from to bind to C, or to demand that C moves if C doesn't want to be bound?
Well, my problem is that, again, I don't think the Constitution is about forcing you as an individual to do things so much as it is about forcing the government to not do things. And so to me, it's not actually bounding you. So, like, we're looking at two different assumptions there, argumentatively. And then that means that it's only the organization bounding itself.
Well, but that's why I'm saying if we switch the argument to a state constitution, because I agree, using the Constitution of the U.S. is a little bit tough, because you can make an argument that it's just states binding each other. Like agree, you can make that argument. Now, I think he could then, if he wanted to, he could go into that argument and argue that states don't actually exist and blah, blah, blah. We can put that aside for a second. It would be much cleaner if he just picked on a state like Massachusetts and said, here's the Constitution of Massachusetts. How does it, and there's a law that says you can't do X, Y, and Z in the state of Massachusetts. How are you bound by that law morally?
I want to bring up one thing. The way I don't think that analogy works, because the state constitutions really come from the same sovereign source, which is the people. So if you bring it down to the state level, you just be talking about the people are the ones who are the contractees of the state constitution. And it's true for the federal one too. Alex said something that I just want to point out, that the US Constitution is the federal government binding themselves. Like, no, the federal government has nothing to do with the US Constitution. It's formed by it. The US Constitution is a compact between the states, which is really the people of the states. So when they wrote it, it's like the concept is people can select representatives and get together and write the Constitution that was going to form the federal government, which formed 13 years after the states, by the way. States were around for 13 years before the federal government formed. So the federal government is not a party to that agreement at all. It's not even part of it. It's formed by it. It's impossible for the federal government. So I just want to say it's not the federal government binding itself. That's the disaster we have in DC, is people go to the federal court system because the federal government's doing something wrong, so we go to the federal courts. It's like, you can't go to the federal courts to stop it. The states have to. And when they wrote the Constitution, all they did is write it and send it back to the states. And then the states, they had conventions picked by the people. It wasn't even the state legislatures. So the state legislatures didn't approve the Constitution. That's not how they did it. They selected a convention, each state, and then they met, just representatives, they met and decided whether to approve it or not. So it's really approved by the people, ultimately, of each state individually.
So the
federal government has
ratification was
nothing to do with
by
it.
some democratic process within each state?
By convention. It wasn't a majority vote. It was done by, they call it convention. And they debated that in Philadelphia. You know, they talked about whether the state legislatures should approve it, or should they do it by convention. They didn't do it by the legislature. They did it by, so what they were trying to do is get back to the people. So I think the counter to Lysander's, to go back to that Lysander-Spooner's argument, if you separate the question, and we've been mixing it up here, and I have been too in my head, he gets into the argument of like 80 years later, or 250 years later for us, are we really bound by this contract because we didn't agree with it? That's an interesting question. He also talks about the question in 1787, was the general public bound by it? That's a different argument, because there was a process where the people picked the representatives got together and they decided to accept it. And then the federal government formed. So there is at least an argument, even though each individual person didn't sign it, there were a bunch of people that signed it. He says no one signed the Constitution. Well, that's not true. Like, every state had a ratifying convention, and the guys that wrote it signed it. They signed something. But every state had a ratifying convention, and some people agreed to it. So you have to get back into this process of, well, should they have had each person in the United States sign it? That's an interesting argument to me, that everybody should be bound by it, otherwise nothing applies. And one other thing I want to throw in, that the point that you were making about what the Constitution is, like, yeah, it's only about the federal government. Constitution says nothing, almost nothing about what a people or even what a state can do. There's a couple limits on states that are in there. Like, it doesn't allow a state to do a couple things. Like, states aren't allowed to do their own money. States aren't allowed to do treaties with other states. By that, they mean England. Florida can't make a treaty with Mexico. And they're not allowed to impose tariffs on each other. And they have to have a Republican form of government, small r Republican, nothing to do with the party. Like, that's pretty much it on the states. Everything else in there is either a expressly delegated authority to tell the federal government, all right, you're allowed to do this, unless we tell you you can't do it anymore, or it's a limit on what they're allowed to do. It doesn't say anything about the people. Sorry to go if I went into too much detail there, but I wanted to go, no, just get my mouth shut.
No, that was my point usually, is that it's not abounding on us as individuals.
It's abounding on them. Yeah, that part. Yeah, totally agree. Because it could be ended. It could. Well, as a practical matter, it doesn't seem to bind anything. Didn't work, right?
Well, but can't you look? Let's step back. Can't you also make the argument that the Constitution has enabled the creation of an entire federal bureaucracy that does indeed force you to do things?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the question is, do they have a right to force you to do those things?
I hope not.
I wouldn't say. I wouldn't use the word enabled. It's just a piece of paper. So like paper, what I think Jefferson or whatever called it a paper barrier. Like a paper barrier doesn't do anything. It's just a piece of paper. If it isn't enforced, and you brought that up earlier, Carter, that somebody has to enforce it or it's not worth anything. And it was supposed to be the states.
But the conversation that Spooner's having is with people who argue that we are morally bound to obey the bureaucracy created by that is the federal government, because we are in some sort of social contract with the Constitution of the United States and our state constitutions and laws, and that obliges us to behave. And his argument is it does not oblige us to behave. I'm trying to understand if there's disagreement with that argument or not here.
It does not oblige us to behave if they don't uphold it. That's their promises. That's their limits.
So
they're not upholding it.
If they were upholding it, I would be obliged to obey it, but they're not upholding it, so I don't have to uphold it either.
When someone reneges on a deal, if you want to get back to the contract thing, you don't have to follow it through on your end.
But so that's an interesting nuance. So you would say, I don't want to. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, Alex. But you would say that if the federal government were, in your opinion, behaving as it were obligated to do via the Constitution, you would likewise be bound to obey. But because it is not, in your opinion, it's not, and I would agree with you, therefore, you are no longer bound by it. You don't
pretty much. I'm going to, to my mind, I'm going to stand on the idea that I still have these rights, that I'm going to push for them. And if they, tell me I can't, then I'm just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. There's no reason for me to just roll over and behave when they tell me to shut up, because they have no authority, according to the Constitution, to tell me to. And I think when it comes down to it, a lot of the extra laws that we are part of, most of those I agree with on an ethical level, basic stuff like don't murder people, okay, don't attack people, okay, fine, I don't I'm okay with that. But when it comes to stuff oh, you don't have a right to be here in a public space, that's where I'm no, I totally do. And I don't have to listen to you tell me I don't.
Right. So
actually, contract-wise, even murder doesn't count. There's nothing in the Constitution about murder. The federal government has no legitimate law against murder. They're not allowed to do that. That isn't a federal power. So I'll disagree with you. No, murder, DC can't.
I mean, on a personal level, I ethically will not commit murder because I already don't agree with it. It has nothing to do with the contract. That's how I feel about murder has nothing to do with the contract.
That's good.
The way the founders would have put this problem is that, so the problem is that I don't know what the percentage is. I'll just take a wild guess, 98% of what the federal government does is illegal because there's no authorization to do it, or it's specifically banned from doing it. So the problem with this conversation is you got to figure out the few things that they're actually allowed to do legally and separate that conversation. They are allowed to create an army if there's a war, but they aren't allowed to, tell you how much water is allowed to be in your toilet when you flush the lever, which they do.
Yeah,
like there's nothing
neither
that
one of you have
authorizes
convinced
that.
me, even in the case where the federal government is behaving itself, where morally you get, why are you morally obligated to
I don't.
obey?
Oh, I would never argue there's any moral. I don't think it is a moral obligation. If even the stuff that's expressly delegated that you might agree was a good idea to do, if we don't want them to do it anymore, then the states could just have a meeting and just close down the federal government. Like, you wouldn't have to invite anybody from DC to the meeting. We could try again, or maybe not have a central
Okay,
government at
so
all.
I'll switch from moral to contractual. How are you legally obligated to obey anything the federal government tells you to do? Where does that legal obligation come from? Because that's his point. His point ultimately is you have no legal obligation to these things written on pieces of paper.
That's why I like separating people who were alive and part of the process of writing it. So this question might have a different answer in 18 or 1900 than now. So there isn't anybody now that agreed to this. Under the argument, and I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but just under the argument that the Constitution was ratified by a convention of representatives chosen by the people of the states. So then you have to say, is it
that representative? Are you bound? Because that's
weren't
one of his
part
points.
of it. One of his points is that, and another interesting one I've never heard before is that it's done by secret ballot. So whoever heard of a contract that's secret, like you're not even allowed to know the people that you're contracting with. So a representative and a president has no person that sent him there. He doesn't know. All he knows is that some computer spit out a total number, and in secret, a bunch of people said, "We want you." Who's he obligated to?
I actually had a big come apart at that point, because when he was talking about the secret ballot, because I was like, there are positives and negatives to the idea of your vote being secret. For the longest time, I never told anyone ever who I voted for or what I voted for on anything, because it was none of their business. And because there is such a thing as discrimination based on your political affiliation, and it causes fights and all this stuff. And so, like, to me, I understand why some people don't want to talk about it. I recently came out with
yeah, but can you put that aside? Because I totally agree. I see all the reasons for a secret ballot. I know why we did it. It doesn't undermine his point that actually it makes there be no real party to the contract. Like, both can be true. It can be that if we have a ballot, there's reasons for it to be secret because you'll get discriminated against, and you could sell your vote and all that kind of stuff that you don't want. And at the same time, it could be right that a secret ballot means you don't actually have a party to an agreement.
Well, and then the other one, though, is that people can't pressure you necessarily if they don't know what you're going to vote for. They can't pressure you in your personal life and your work and everything like that. But so to some extent, it gives you some protections, but there is such a thing as like votes in organizations that are for a contract that they don't know how people went. Like they do that there too. So it's not as if it's something that's only for states. It happens.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Like a board of trustees may have a secret vote for a motion. They may not necessarily, state verbally and openly what direction they want to go on a contract. They can do that too. So it's like it just kind of depends
that you're missing there.
No, to me, the idea is that it's a trade-off. Like, it is a trade-off, and I don't think it's unviable.
Ballot. Right? I think you're reacting as I viscerally did when I read it, because I agree with you. Like, I wouldn't want a not secret ballot. But he's not arguing for a not secret ballot. He's arguing for not a ballot, in which case this doesn't matter, right? So, like, we don't have to get upset that he's arguing against the secret ballot, because he's arguing against the ballot fundamentally. He's pointing out some problems that happen because it's secret. And I think if it wasn't secret, he could point out a whole different set of problems, which you're talking about some of them, right? So I think the point is there's problems either way. And
Yeah,
the
it's a
Board of Trustees
trade-off.
thing
Like,
is different.
pros and cons on both sides on that. And I'm not just say that's not true. I totally agree that it's not clear which one's better.
Well, I think he would say neither. Like, you should not have such a thing, right? Like, and the Board of Trustees secret ballot doesn't. That's not an apt analogy, because the Board of Trustees, they are voluntarily members of an organization that has rules about voting and have agreed to bind themselves each individually through whatever process. It could be that they flip a coin. It doesn't matter. They've agreed, and they can back out and no longer be part of that organization. All of that is premised. So all of the private industry stuff is the underlying foundation of that is that you are part of that voluntarily. And so that allows any set of apparatus, any rules you want to build on top of that. You can do trade-offs between secret or not, or should we flip a coin, or should we let short people vote first or last, or like, you can do anything you want, even if it's stupid, because anyone's voluntarily a part of that. In the government, that's not true.
Well, then how
Right.
do you get any kind of involvement from your people besides just telling them what you're going to do? Like,
Well, I
if
think
you're going
he
to
would
have,
argue you don't have a government. That's where
but
he's
then
going.
you have, if you don't have any kind of organization, because that's the problem, is that they call it government, but to me, it's always organization. By the time an organization is deciding what people are doing, it doesn't matter if it's the state or something private. They're making decisions for people.
No, it
Essentially.
does, because the state is the only one authorized to use force, right? So it does matter. Like, I don't.
Who
like
says they
if-
won't use force in a private society?
Well, that now we're getting back to, like, yes, they could, but there's now they can hire competing. You can have competing defenses. Like, you can move with your feet. You don't have to be part of their thing. Yes, someone could always use force, but his point is the state is granting a monopoly on force, and that monopoly on force is dangerous because there's no recourse in that event. In the event that the state goes awry, there's no recourse. In the event that your private security force decides to go awry, well, there's lots of other private security forces. Most people actually don't want to murder, and they don't want mayhem. I mean, if they did, the government wouldn't work either. I mean, if they had the police, if every time you went to the store, people were shooting each other and the cops always had to, come arrest people, like, society would break down if there was a large number of lawbreakers generally. So most people don't want that environment anyway. So a rogue organization that starts to do something would receive a lot of pressure and presumably physical pushback from other organizations people have hired. Like, I wouldn't want to be part of an organization that did that. But I can't opt out. Like, for the government right now is arresting people for using drugs, and because there's drug laws, there's a war on drugs. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to pay them for that. Would I be happy to pay them for we'll say the easy example of foreign defense? Sure. Yeah. I don't want someone invading or bombing my city. Like, okay, that I'll pay for. But I don't really care if someone wants to do pot on the street corner. And I don't want to, and I think that's the initiation of force to stop someone from, like, so I don't want to pay for that. And I don't have that option unless there's competition. I think that's the argument.
I just don't see, even with competition, because we see places develop a monopoly, even on.
Where's an example of a monopoly that's developed without the government's assistance?
In the US, that one I'm not going to touch because I don't know enough of the history, but I've seen in, like, less stable areas monopolies of force, and they're not.
Monopolies of force. You mean like warlords and in Africa or something?
Yes. Then there's no way to, like, what do you do at that point? It's like you're struggling to get food even, so you're not going to be able to hire someone else to protect you necessarily.
Right. So I think if
the only argument,
go ahead.
The only argument for government having that job is you're saying that you don't like this particular monopoly of force that maybe you do have a choice of following, or maybe you don't, and you're going to replace it with something that you definitely do not have any option. Like, you're going to put a monopoly on force and assign that role to the government, and you're done. That's it.
I don't actually believe in a monopoly of force, even when the government has it. So just to be clear, I'm not actually arguing for that.
Yeah.
Oh wait, so wait, how would that work?
But I'm saying, no, I meant my
Sorry, go ahead, Keith. We'll get back to Alex in a minute.
I was gonna clarify the question, or clarify my point, that the argument, and I think you've used it once or twice before, that you see some problem in like the rating system in the video game industry. It's the same question, national defense rating system for video games. I don't think they're different questions. You can either have a private thing do it that could compete, or you could have a monopoly do it, which is the government. That's what you're going to call the government. And by the way, the government also has a monopoly on force. So if you don't like it, too bad. So to me, if you point out a problem, and I see people do this all the time about everything to do with the government, everything the government does, they look at it and you say, well, private business could do that. And then people say, well, they might do a lousy job. And so, but it's not an argument to say, well, then therefore the government should do it. And if anybody that makes that argument, I would just say, well, give me an example of something the government does really well that would be impossible to do privately. I would ask you that question, like, can you name something the government does really well? I can't.
They get people to vote.
I don't know, maybe there's something.
Do that. Well, never mind.
I can't think of one. Can you think of one, Carter?
They tax me.
Name something the government. They're good at monopolies. As far as the monopoly goes, it's impossible to have a monopoly without a government. Like, there's no such thing as a monopoly without government. You need a government to have a monopoly. That's what Amazon and Facebook would like to do right now. They would like to turn themselves into a monopoly, and therefore they're love to get involved with the government.
I want to get back to something Alex said, because she was pushing back on monopoly of force, and so maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're talking about.
So I don't actually think that the US government has monopoly of force, because for one thing, we have so many different jurisdictions, and we have LEOs coming at each other from different angles in investigation. So we have federal agencies, we have state agencies, we have city agencies and county agencies. That's not a monopoly. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I know it seems like it when you talk.
Can you say, I don't want to be subject to these laws and have these police come after me? I want to choose a different one. Like, can I say, I don't want the ATF? I choose the Texas, if there's an equivalent of, I don't know, if there's an ATF, and like, that's the one I want. I want the Texas Rangers. I don't want the ATF.
You can through voting and, campaigning. Like, people go into things to change.
Well, but that doesn't count. I can't, right? Other people can. Like, if a majority of people vote for a particular thing that I want, then it happens. But that's not me having agency. I can't change it.
It's not agency to speak your mind that you want this to go away and that you think other people should push for it too.
Voting's not
obviously that's agency, but like it's not that I don't have control over the outcome. Right? I don't, like, if I said to you, well, we're going to make rape legal because 51% of the population is male. Like, well, you could vote against it. Go ahead. Like, well, that's not an argument. Like, you still don't have, like, that's not allowed. Like, you don't actually have, you can't just say, well, you can vote for this thing, that you can vote against this encroachment of your rights.
That's not a very good example, though.
Encroach my rights, then I don't win.
That's not a very good example, though, Carter, because they did eventually push for rape to become illegal, and that was
Why
it wasn't
is that
just
not a good example?
It wasn't just women pushing for it; it was men too pushing for rape to be illegal.
Right, so they made a good decision at that point. That's good. Like, I'm not saying everything that people vote for is wrong, but I am saying that it's certainly naive to think that, oh, don't worry, the majority will vote for the thing that will leave you alone. If that were true, we would be in a minarchist government right now.
I'm not saying don't worry. I'm saying that if you want things to be better, you have to, you know, take part in using your First Amendment rights and, you know, getting other people to agree with you.
Right, but I'm not saying, like, that's neither here nor there. What I'm saying is, it doesn't matter what I'm like, whether I use my First Amendment rights or argue or whatever. The point is, I can't choose to not have the ATF police me. I don't have that choice. There is a monopoly on force. Like, yes, there's overlapping monopolies, but there is a hierarchy, right? Sometimes that hierarchy is not super clear. But there is a hierarchy, so the FBI can come in and take over jurisdiction from the local authorities, right? And maybe the state cops can take over jurisdiction from your town cop. But so there's a hierarchy, but there is a monopoly. I can't just say I'm opting out, and you can't say, well, yeah, you can't opt out, but you're allowed to bitch about opting out. Like, well, that's not the same thing. Like, I don't want to be murdered. Like, being able to say I don't want to be murdered and not actually being murdered are two different things, right?
When you talk about the hierarchy, there's really only two levels, and I think we have to be clear if we're talking about the United States versus a state in general. Because when I talk about government and monopoly about force, I'm talking about the state. And we glossed over the difference between federal and state and what we call U.S. state. But in the United States, the states are the state, right? The federal government is an agreement between the states. So as far as authority goes, like the FBI versus the state, it's like, no, it's the other way around. The state government has higher authority than the FBI. If a sheriff,
well,
not in practice for most part, but it's because state governments and sheriffs don't have the balls to put it in practice. But there are plenty of examples of states doing it. Marijuana is one. We're going to eventually overturn federal government marijuana laws by them just having to give up. So the federal government always has to use the states as part of the team. So the FBI, like ATF, can't enforce anything without local authorities. They almost never even try. There's not that many agents. There's only 5,000 or something.
Right, but my point wasn't that
they always use.
My point wasn't to articulate the hierarchy. I said that there is confusion over the hierarchy, and that is true. However, there's still a monopoly. Like, I can't say I don't want the ATF here. Like, and like I can't say I don't want to be subject to this. Now, I could if I'm in a state that's willing to stand behind me and say, yeah. Like, but that doesn't practically happen. And if that were the case, I couldn't say, well, I don't want you either.
You personally couldn't, right? You personally couldn't. Or it would be difficult. But you could, in a small scale, and this is the anarchy thing, like going smaller is better. So if you take it down to the county sheriff level, it's easier to talk about. So if the ATF is doing something that is, number one, unconstitutional, and you got a sheriff that'll stand up, you could actually do something. An example would be the ATF has used medical marijuana registration in states that provide it to the federal government, and they cross-check that with firearm registration or NICS checks. I don't know how they do it, but they find out who has guns, and they go and they say, well, you're not allowed to have a gun if you're a medical marijuana patient. And there's plenty of examples of sheriffs saying, no, you can't do that. Or ATF agents come. If a sheriff stops an ATF agent and says, I'll arrest you if you try to confiscate his guns, the ATF agents have to leave. Like, the sheriff is a higher authority. He works.
I understand that, but we're not. That
so I
doesn't
think
undermine the argument that we're in a monopoly. I can't opt out of my sheriff.
It is a monopoly. The sheriff becomes a monopoly.
If the sheriff sucks, I can't opt out of him, right? Like,
no. And voting doesn't.
If I don't like AT&T as my service provider, I can choose. I was gonna say Sprint, but maybe AT&T bought them. I don't know who. Like Verizon, right? Like, I can choose Verizon. I can choose T-Mobile. Like, I can switch cell phone providers because I don't like AT&T, right? I can't do that I can't do that with the laws. I can't say I don't like this set of laws and the way you enforce them. I want to switch to a different set of laws and how they're enforced. I can't.
And I agree with you. I was just trying to separate the monopoly of force and where it's coming from. In general, I'm just referring it to, it's all one thing. So the president and the sheriff are all the same thing when we talk about the government having monopoly of force. If a cop shoots you, he can say, oops, I made a mistake. But if you shoot the cop, you're going to go to jail, even if it's a mistake, right? There's a difference there.
Yeah, and my point is only, I get that there's confusion about the hierarchy and who has jurisdiction, because the government apparatus above me is somewhat fuzzy, and there's self-contradictory laws and stuff. So like the sheriff can argue and the FBI can argue, and someone can say we're not going to, I have jurisdiction or you have jurisdiction, but that apparatus itself can't be replaced, right?
So I do tend to, and I just did. I get distracted by that difference in the levels. But really, where I was ultimately going with that is that when it's towards anarchy, is also for small scale. To me, I look at like anarchy usually is smaller scale things. Everything happens more locally. So when you get down to the sheriff, like if you as a step in that direction, if you really let the sheriff and get a sheriff that will use the power that he should have, it helps a lot with that. It moves it away from that monopoly of force. But you still do have a monopoly. It's just that the sheriff is closer to something that you voluntarily pick, because it's at the county level. Now you got like you and your neighbors are picking the person, and you get to voluntarily pick it. Sheriffs are elected. It's closer. It's not there.
I have a much
because
larger
you can't have
percentage
two
influence
sheriffs
on my sheriff than I do the president of the United States, for example.
A lot more.
Right.
Voting for president is, when people claim, is your voice heard? I think Michael Malice did that in the last chapter. It's like, your voice isn't getting heard by voting. I like the meme that's been going around that says that voting is the adult version of writing a letter to Santa Claus.
Right.
I hate people who argue that if you don't vote that you're not making your voice heard, and like it is of your voice being heard. You're saying that these two people, or however many candidates there are, all suck. That's a statement. And
maybe you don't care.
Yeah.
The problem is it's not clear. So is it making your voice heard if no one knows why you didn't vote? And I don't mind. I've always told people who I vote for. I mean, I think I don't. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
We're dealing with the delay, the internet delay here. The voting for president doesn't matter that much. I mean, I've been doing it since like 1980. It didn't matter at all. I don't know why I bothered. And I did vote most of the time in New Jersey. So, but I mean, and I don't mind I've never minded telling people I vote for. To me, if making your voice heard includes saying like, hi, I'm Keith, I voted for whoever I voted for. I'll just say it. I mean, last election, I voted for Thomas Massey. I wrote him in. I mean, I didn't want either of the two possibilities. Like, I didn't want either of them in there. I'm not voting for them. But I did want to make a statement. I don't know if anybody cares, but I picked somebody that's already going to DC, because I wouldn't wish that job on anybody that wasn't already signed up. So I picked somebody that's already going there that's doing some pretty cool things. So I wrote Thomas Massey. The time before, I didn't vote at all. I looked at the Clinton-Trump fiasco and campaign. I'm like, this is ridiculous. But nobody knows why I didn't vote. A lot of people don't vote because they don't feel like bothering, or because it was a good movie on Netflix that night or something.
Doesn't that mean though that the political question is not important? That's a statement, even like saying that I think that this is not important. I think watching this movie on Netflix is more important than voting.
Yeah, and if it was a good movie, it is more important than picking the president. I don't care about the president that much. I don't think it matters that much who becomes president. Now I might argue, and I do make the point, like there are a couple elections important. I would say like the most important one is the school board, like that, I wouldn't want to miss that vote. I think it's really important to vote for school board and sheriff. That's pretty important. And then as you move up from there, it's less and less important. Like, governor could matter. President, I don't know. In the long run, I don't think it makes much difference who the president is. It certainly doesn't matter which party's president. Government continues to grow. They borrow more money. The ATF had more enforcements under Trump than under Obama, and more under Obama than Bush, and more under like what metric do you look at? They borrow more. Trump was the biggest tax and spend president in U.S. history. That's a fact. A lot of Republicans, smash it on the head with the flag and start saying the Pledge of Allegiance over and over. But that's just true, right? Trump was the biggest tax and spend president in U.S. history. Obama, when he was president, he was the biggest tax and spend president in history. And you just go back through them, it's pretty much the same. So I don't really care who wins the president. I don't think it matters that much.
Well, but as Alex said, like
people
tell you you can't complain if you don't vote, and that bothers me as well, Alex, because I feel like if you're stuck in a cage with two gorillas, and one of them's wearing blue shorts and the other one's wearing red shorts, and the zookeeper's like, pick which gorilla you want to maul you, and you're like, I don't actually care which gorilla mauls me. Like, I don't want to be mauled, frankly, and if there's a way to escape the cage, I would like that. And they say, nope, too late. The blue one won. You're getting mauled by the blue one, and I start complaining about getting mauled. They're like, well, you could have voted for the red one to maul you. It's like, well, that's not my my problem. Isn't that the color of the shorts of the gorilla? It's that I'm getting mauled. And so, I think so long as there's not an option to get the government out of my life, I'm not obligated to exercise that option. Like, I'm not allowed. I can still complain because I was given two horrible choices, and asked to pretend like they mattered a lot.
And I 100% agree with your right to do so. Like, to not vote and bitch about it as much as you want, go ahead. Like,
Right.
I think it's absolute BS to say that means you're not enacting your rights. That's just one right. I'm sorry. And in the grand scheme of thing, it matters a lot less than your ability to actually write and speak up in other forms.
And that's getting back to what you said earlier, like, speak up and use your voice. Well, that's probably a lot more important than who you vote for. I'm in California. I mean, it kind of doesn't matter who I vote for president. We're pulling the donkey lever as a state, and that's what we're doing. So
when I say your voice, I do not mean your vote. Like 100%.
Okay.
Right.
This year, like, the four of us here are doing way more than voting does. Just right. This episode, right? I'm going to read, if you don't mind. It's short. Michael Malice quote, the last article, and anybody that follows Michael Malice wouldn't be surprised that his article's the final one. It was on voting. It was called "Why I Didn't Vote This Year and Won't Vote Next Time" or something. Before I read this, on a little background, he wrote the book on Kim Jong-un. It's called The Unauthorized Autobiography of Kim Jong-un.
Dear reader.
I have Dear Reader. Yeah, thanks, Chicken Rare. Dear Reader, the ultimate. Dear Reader, but a dear leader is what they call him, right? He's called the Dear Leader. And, the name of the country is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. That's North Korea is the spot. But yeah, it's a North Korea is a democratic country. They have elections, right? You're required to vote for the Dear Leader. But there's it's kind of a subtle difference. Michael Malice brings up the point. There's a subtle difference between the North Korean elections for president and the US ones. In North Korea, there's only one person on the ballot. In the US, there's two. So you have to understand that background to get his quote. The quote is, this is Michael Malice: "No matter how absurd the state line, a huge majority of the populace can be found to promulgate it. People will say with a straight face that having one choice for Dear Leader is tyranny, but having two is freedom. is the second choice on the ballot really the qualitative difference? Damn good question, Michael.
Yeah.
Well, and I would argue that over the last like 40 years, there's been so much writing and just depiction to show that there's actually only one choice morally, and the other choice isn't a real choice.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You have this choice, or you're a racist. Those are your choices.
Yeah.
So that's not a choice from a moral perspective. If you buy into it, it's not a choice, and that's the bullshit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So Alex, what do you think about voting for somebody that can't possibly win, one of the third party choices?
I have voted third party before because my goal was to get them up to 5% popular vote, because I knew that would make a difference.
That's okay. I was curious. Yeah, I have. In fact, I do say who I voted for. So I voted for my first election, John Anderson. I don't remember him. I'm an old guy. That was before I heard about libertarian. I voted for Harry Brown. I voted for Ross Perot. I voted for Ron Paul both times he wrote it. I voted for Thomas Massey. One time I did vote for a major party candidate. It was a Republican. And that is the one time that I don't like to talk about who I voted for because I'm embarrassed. and the reason that I voted for is that a friend of mine was his press secretary, and his life goal was to be press secretary of the White House, and he probably would have got that job if the guy won. And he was a Republican candidate, and he talked me into it. And then later I read more about him. Like, oh, no. So anyway, that's the one I would prefer not to say public. I'll tell you privately if you want.
I did a speech when I was in college about the two-party system and how failed it is because of the fact that most people are not voting for a candidate but against a candidate, and that's not really a sign that you care about who the candidate is at all.
It's a sign that you're afraid.
Yeah, and someone made you afraid. And so I was like, that's a failure of democracy, of representative democracy.
It's a good question. You know, when you say, how the hell did Joe Biden win? Like, that's an interesting question. And even if you talk to people who voted for him, you say, you know, a guy that like can't remember where the front door is. I know he's only lived there for 6 or 8 months, but see the video of him like walking and he walks past the sidewalk. He doesn't know where the front door is. How did he win? He didn't campaign. He didn't bother with that part. The only president I know of that didn't campaign before him was George Washington. He won for a different reason. His second term, his campaign consisted of, they called him into the Congress and they like bugged him, like, we really want you to stay president. He's like, all right, I'll do it if I get elected. He turned around and left. Never talked about it again. That was the whole thing. Like, ever since then, everybody wants the job. So I always like the argument, I don't know where I heard it from, but anybody that wants the president should not have that job. Like, if somebody wants that job, there's no way you want them to have that job. You're better off with somebody. Joe Biden's an example of how you'd be better off with someone that's a random pick out of the phone. Yeah. Like how about if you could vote against Trump and for a random pick out of the phone book? I suspect the random pick out of the phone book would have won too. Maybe would have got more votes. I would rather have a random pick out of the phone book than Joe Biden.
I was going to say, I might have voted random pick out of the phone book for that. Yeah.
I might have voted for that instead of writing in Thomas Massey. But, you know, not voting or writing somebody in, I don't know that. I'd like to think it does anything. I'd like to think voting for Ron Paul did something, or Harry Brown, or Ross Perot, but I don't know. And the reason I didn't vote 2 times ago is because the Libertarian Party is off their rocker. The last 2 times I always had, I most of the time had that option. Like, okay, there's somebody running Libertarian. Ron Paul was an easy one. Harry Brown was an easy one. But most of the time, the Libertarian Party candidate pretty good. But the last 2 times, they're like, I don't want them either.
Yeah.
I think I would rather have Trump. Maybe, I don't know. I belay that one. I take that back.
So let's get back to the book because this
Go
is
back.
fun, but
Sorry. Yeah.
we could probably talk about this stuff forever. I do want to talk about the book a little bit because, by the way, for those of you just joining, we're talking about the Anarchist Handbook. Supposedly, we're having a conversation about the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice, which is a collection of essays. And the collection of essays starts off from 1793 all the way through 2014, I think. Or actually, Michael Malice's essay is the latest, so 2021. And I one of the things I liked about it is I don't know if I mentioned this on air earlier or not, but I came at anarchy. I became an anarcho-capitalist without having read any anarchist stuff at all. I only read Ayn Rand and thought about some of her arguments and then went off and thought on my own, really. And I didn't really... She was not an anarchist at all, but I reached the conclusion on my own, and I've never actually read any anarchist thought. So it was quite interesting for me, and I thought it was really interesting that he chose to put communists / I don't know if they would call themselves communists, but it's like socialist, like radical left anarchy in with anarcho-capitalist style anarchy. So you had, Peter Kropotkin in with Murray Rothbard, right? And I don't know, did you get anything, either one of you, out of the leftist anarchy stuff? Because it was interesting to me, but I don't know that I got a whole lot. I don't know. Did you guys get anything out of the leftist anarchy stuff?
Dynamite's really hard to make.
Yes, I did learn that. Don't make your own dynamite.
Yeah, don't do it. Probably better just.
I was wondering if you couldn't find enough stuff to put in the book. It was interesting.
I mean, he
it
loves
does
Emma
help.
Goldman, so I think he chose that intentionally.
Okay. It's interesting to try to understand the concept of left anarchy, and a lot of people accuse the rioters in Portland of anarchy, and that anarchist gets a bad word because of that, gets thrown around like that, and just have to say, for the purpose of here, like as you guys know, that's not anarchy. Like, they just want control of power. So that comes from people using the term anarchy, meaning you oppose the government. So if you're against the vax passports and mask orders, that means you're an anarchist by definition. Like, so yeah, the founders of the U.S. weren't anarchists. The people who seceded in the South in 1860s, they weren't anarchists. Those people in Portland are not anarchists. They just want the reins of power.
Right.
So as far as the left, your question, I think it helped me understand that, because I don't understand the idea of left and right anarchy. Like, that makes no sense to me. How can you have a left and right anarchy? But it is true. It does exist. So I would say it helped me separate that and why there is even such a concept. Because as you did, I never read anything about anarchy. Never anything good, anyway. Never anything from a real anarchist.
My note in the Peter Kropotkin section is that I at least from what I can tell, the leftist anarchy has at least one bad premise and at least one really weird psychological trait. And the bad premise is, well, I've made a couple bad premises. One of them is this premise of equality. Like, people are actually and should end up being equal, like equity. They have an equity premise, and they're opposed to private property. I think they view private property somehow as the initiation of force, which doesn't make philosophic sense to me, but that seems to be their consistent view. But there's also like a psychological outlook of just envy and resentment. When I read some of this leftist stuff, it was like they had wildly outlandish things to say that were just not true. Like, rich people only get rich through, basically stealing money from the poor, and like it was this kind of really odd perspective that I didn't seem like it went with anarchy to me. I'm not sure how you enforce no private property without a state, but like Mikhail Bakunin, who was the guy who was the socialist who I think was was he a contemporary of Marx, but he kind of predicted, look, this is where Marx is going to go. Marx wants to use the state. That's not the right way to do it. You have to use it do it without a state. I'm still not sure after reading this exactly how a stateless society doesn't have private property, unless it's just we're going to. Yeah, I don't really know. How do you? If I have a shirt, can you just come rip it off my back in a stateless leftist anarchy society?
I don't understand the concept. It sounds it's impossible. At least I don't know how to do it. I guess I would say that.
It's idealism. It's not reality. My problem with this is that no matter what, a hierarchy forms. It doesn't matter what kind of society you're trying to not form. A hierarchy is going to form. That's, I mean, it forms in nature.
That's the equity premise that I think is just wrong, right? There are going to be people who rise and fall in different areas based on their abilities and talents and possibly their resources, luck, lots of stuff.
I mean, they talk about like the ultimate communism system, the ideal, the fantasy of it. Like everybody just works hard and they have the farms and they grow and everybody shares all the property and everything's great. And like you can, on a family size unit, maybe do that, right? And people do make collectives. When you try to do a country the size of Russia, what always happens is some group decides to take over and be the elite and take power. So I think the whole leftist anarchy that they describe in here, I don't remember them all, so I'm making a blanket statement, but I suspect they all kind of summarize in like a Soviet Union, communist China kind of end. No matter how you do it, it ends up like Cuba, right?
Well, I mean, I think
because some thug always, if you don't have the concept of private security, private defense, private courts somehow, then somebody will jump into that space and take all the guns away, and pretty soon you got Soviet Union. That's probably what happens in a leftist anarchy.
Bakunin claimed that was going to happen to Marx. Like he seems to have predicted, like, because Marx explicitly wanted the state involved. But there is this leftist anarchy that seems to be, and I don't think they don't articulate it well enough for me to understand, but they seem to have this assumption that they can accomplish this utopia of no private property without state involvement. And I think Keith, you're right. I think they're looking at like small units like families and communes where like, look, we can all share. If we all just kind of learn to get along and share, like a VW bus full of people together on a farm, we'll be happy. But that doesn't scale well, I don't think.
It's naive to put a kind word on it. Childish maybe is a better word. It's people who think that there's there aren't any evil people. Like you have to just start from the premise that there are actually evil people. Like that's just true. So whatever you do design for a society that's bigger than some fairly small size, I don't know what the number is, because there are successful communes. I could probably get up to hundreds, but it doesn't work when you get big enough because you just can't filter the people enough. I think as a practical matter.
Is it filtering the people, or is it just that? Because I've been thinking about communes, and I think one of the issues is at a small scale, you feel social pressure because you're very seen. Everyone knows you, and it's like, oh, that's Alex. She doesn't pull her weight around here, and Alex feels bad about not pulling her weight a little bit, and like, all right, I got to pull my weight. I want to fit in, and like, right? But if it's like 10 million people, no one points at her and says like, that's Alex. And we all know Alex. She hasn't been pulling her weight. She's just like, yeah, I'm not pulling my weight. I don't know you guys. I don't care. I don't care what you think of me. Like,
well, Well, and then does mob justice form against me and eventually they kill me?
Maybe, I mean, I don't know, or if you're able to like live in the shadows enough that no one really knows, like maybe they're like, well, I assume she does her thing, everyone else does their thing. I mean, or maybe a lot of people become that, right? Maybe it's a society full of Alexes, right? What's that joke in the Soviet Union? They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, right? It's like, okay, like, yeah. I mean, at some point, if there's no even social accountability for it, right?
What I
It should
found
work by
what I found hilarious about the commune example was that in one of them, I think it was Tolstoy, he said they form their own taxation and their own police. And I'm like, you mean government?
Yeah,
like,
that sounded like government. Yeah.
I'm like, you're talking about government now?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a little bit funny. The left stuff, I mean, I like some of the things that some of them say in the leftist stuff, and then they just kind of go off the rails with statements that just make no sense. But I don't know. Voltairine? What a funny name. Voltairine de Cleyre. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. She kind of made these, I thought, were interesting distinctions between. She was the one that was talking about how she was trying to make the case that anarchy wasn't a foreign concept, that it was very part and parcel to the American spirit, which I don't think is incorrect based on like the spirit of it. Maybe not the like this is exactly what we should do, but like that the spirit of anarchy is quite American in many ways, and her point was to talk about that and to kind of convince Americans that this wasn't a foreign thing, but this was, an American spirit. And she draws a lot of distinctions between tradition and practice. Like, we have this idea of something, but then the way that we practice it, like we have this. I'm not quoting her here. Well, I can quote her, right? It's an American tradition that a standing army is a standing menace to liberty, right? But then the next thing is in practice, in Jefferson's presidency, she talks about army was reduced to 33,000 men. But then, okay, now we have a standing army of 83,251 men. She's writing at the time when Theodore Roosevelt was just president, so she talks about the size of the government, being the kind of tradition being limited, but in practice, TR just added 99,000 offices at an annual expense of 1.6 billion, which would be nice if that's all we were at today. So I like that there's this. One of the things that I appreciate even about the left anarchists is they're pointing out something that I think a lot of people don't want to admit, which is the ideas of what American government was supposed to be and the actuality of American government are night and day. They're not anything like what it was purported to be. I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm just making an argument.
But that doesn't mean that their ideas of what ought to be are going to be realistic in application either. Like,
well, no, I mean, I was quoting a leftist
Yeah.
anarchist, so certainly I don't agree that her ideas would be applicable. But the idea that I don't know. I really do think that it's tough for people, and I know I'm not trying to start a fight. I think it's tough for people to wrap their head around, like, it could be different than it is. Like, we don't actually have to think, like, things aren't what they said they were going to be. It actually hasn't worked. Like, it's not working. Like, the government, the Constitution didn't work. Who was Keith, you might have remembered this quote, but there was I don't know if it was Spooner or Friedman. Maybe it was Rothbard. Someone made one of the ANCAPs said something about either the Constitution created what we have today, in which case it sucks, or it was unable to prevent what we have today, in which case it sucks, right? So it's like, that's kind of a truth, right? I mean, I don't know what's the argument to that. We are not really, even given that not everyone on this chat as anarchy and you just want smaller government or more liberty, we don't have that. And whatever we didn't get us there.
So I have a question about the standing army thing. I was talking to somebody offline about how libertarians and anarchists don't want a standing army. And I was arguing about, like, if we take it down to the smallest level, like my house, I have a gun in my bedstand. It's loaded. If someone comes in, I'm going to shoot them. Fair warning, you know. So in my, if you go
presumably if they come in uninvited, but okay.
Yes, uninvited guest. A person with malintent comes in, I'm going to shoot them. So my argument then, if you go up the line, is why wouldn't we want a loaded handgun, aka a standing army, ready and waiting to, in case someone comes in and tries to attack our home, being the country?
I think the argument, I don't remember if it was Friedman or not, but I think the argument is, well, it's dangerous because A, it's expensive, and B, it's dangerous. And there's a compromise that was better that I think was Friedman that proposed it, which actually took from the founding fathers, which was the idea of like, okay, well, there's a small number of organizers that are standing that we pay for, like officers. But then you have kind of regular people who train and do their thing, and you can think of those as militias and whatever, and you have an armed populace, and you could imagine in a world in which they kind of do this on their own. They maybe coordinate a little bit with the few paid officers. They're kind of on the ready to be used, but you're not constantly paying for a standing army, right? And they're not constantly looking for something to do.
Well, and in this particular situation, I would be like, okay, minarchist, I'm willing to pay some taxes to have, because the person that I was talking to brought up the militias, and I said, well, that's kind of like having your bullets out in little rows, not in a magazine. You know, it's like, hold on, wait, let me organize my magazine and load it into my gun. And when there's people coming, like, that you may not have warning for. So I get the premise, I guess, but I don't know if
it's hard to say tactically though. Like in modern warfare, let's be honest. If there's a problem in modern warfare, first of all, if an army comes in, like an army comes into, let's pick Texas because they're on the border. I don't think the army will fare well if they're using small arms against regular Texas citizens. I think they'll be defeated. There's enough people, even if there's not a lot of organization, with zero organization, there's a hell of a lot of guns and lots of people are armed. It's difficult, but that's not the threat we face today anyway. The threat we face today is like, oh, North Korea just fired a nuke at San Francisco.
Right. So are you suggesting that a private company would be allowed to have the defensive nukes against
I'm with Friedman on this, in that I think the national defense issue is a hard issue, and I don't really know what the right thing for that is. I would advocate a path towards anarchy that vectors through minarchism, where the last thing the government does is like provide for national defense. And I would and maybe it's compulsory tax, and then maybe it switches to voluntary tax and see if that works, and then we worry about privatizing it. That's kind of because I don't think we can convince people otherwise. Like, I don't actually think it's that easy to convince people. There was a passage, man, I wish I could find who said it, but there's a passage about this, and Beverly always gets angry when this is my argument. Not angry. She always chides me when this is my argument to people, because it's never convincing and sufficient. Let me see if I can find it, because someone made the argument more eloquently than I can, and it might have been Rothbard.
Well, while you're looking, and say the founding fathers were adamantly against the standing army. So
Okay.
that was the point of the militia. And the militia was the people, was basically all able-bodied men from 18 to 40 or something like that. And there were periods of time, like early on, there were states where you had to maintain a weapon. Congress has the authority, as far as guns go, like Congress has the authority to tell every able-bodied adult male, probably not just men, that they have to have a certain type of weapon with a certain caliber and maintain a certain number of rounds on hand. Like that would be Congress's authority to equip and regulate the militia. But as far as like a standing army, no, that was never actually authorized. And they were against it because the standing army works for the government. The militia doesn't. So say it's dangerous. So the concept is today in modern weaponry, you got the F-16 problem, like Joe Biden pointed out that we don't have F-16s and nuclear missiles. But I think you have to note, like, the Taliban don't have F-16s and nuclear missiles. They just kicked the U.S. out of Afghanistan after 20 years of trying. The Viet Cong didn't have any F-16s. They kicked the Americans out of Vietnam. Like, we're losing wars all over the place. So you bring up the problem of the missiles and the jet fighters. Like, you definitely need them when two governments are fighting each other. Like, if the U.S. went up against Russia, you better have some nukes and some fighters and aircraft carriers and submarines and the whole bit. But in an anarchist society, and I'm working this through myself too, but in an anarchist society, you don't have governments fighting governments. And those things are mostly useful for governments. If an army comes in, as Carter pointed out, is like an army can't invade Texas very easily.
So let's say that today I snap my magic fingers and the United States becomes an anarchist society. And do you think that we could defend ourselves if China decides they like our land and our resources and sends their army of a gajillion people to us, or their fighter jets?
They don't have an army. Yeah, if they had a gajillion, we would have a tough time, but they don't have a gajillion. I don't actually know the numbers, but I've heard, like, the American gun owners are the largest army in the world.
They are.
By a lot.
Yeah.
Like it's 10 or 100 times or something.
I'd say that's protecting us from invasion more than our standing military is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other?
Now, they could bomb a city, right?
I think we have to compare things to the present state. So, like, China could do that now.
Yes.
They're not. Now, is it because they think we'll nuke them? Maybe. Right? Maybe it's because they think we'll nuke them. But I forget who was talking about this. One of the things I really enjoyed was some of the history about wars, and like how in Europe it was actually like the normal citizens wouldn't even really care or know if their country was at the state of war with another country, and it was like the nobles fighting each other, and they're like, yeah. And passports were actually originally designed to let people travel from one country at war with another country, back and forth, because like the regular people just were uninvolved in the war and they didn't care. And governments, China runs a tax farm just like the US. China runs a tax farm. That's what they want. Destroying a bunch of infrastructure and killing people actually doesn't give China what they want. What China wants is to expand their tax farm. So if they were going to take over, they would be a lot smart. I mean, they already are expanding quite intelligently without using any weapons, right?
They're buying a bunch of land.
Right? They're doing a lot of stuff to take over. So I mean, they've bought up a bunch of Africa, like, and they're in South America. Like, they are expanding, but not militarily. So the question's like, okay, if we were an anarchist nation tomorrow, I don't say nation, but an anarchist territory tomorrow,
Mhm.
Like, what would China want out of us? There's no infrastructure to collect taxes, so they couldn't come take over the bureaucracy of tax collection. They could come in and say, we're going to force you to do stuff, but they would have to bring the bureaucracy and infrastructure with them, right? Which I don't know would go well. I guess they could nuke some cities and say, like, you have to agree. I maybe, and maybe in that case, an anarchist society does need some sort of large, like a deterrent against large governments. I don't know, but I don't think it's that easy. I don't think it's that easy to come over and, like, to go take over an entire geographical region that is a peaceful anarchist region that's like self-sustaining. That's, you have to remember, without the tax of a government, and I don't mean just their taxes, but I mean without the resource drain on a government, society is much more prosperous. So you've got a very prosperous society with no apparatus designed for a central authority to collect taxes or do anything. There is no like, every time you buy something, computers go to the state somewhere and, like, they know what your sales tax is. There's no income, there's no, like, IRS, there's no system of reporting. There's not an apparatus to take over. They would have to build it. And I don't know, I'm not saying they wouldn't want to do that and they wouldn't try, but I don't know that it's as straightforward as just, we send some troops into your city and tell you to obey.
I
Okay.
don't think that that's how they would go about it, though. Even if state or no state here, I think a foreign power would probably use fiscal means
Right.
to
That's what
take
they're doing.
over instead.
Yeah.
And digital means. I honestly don't think we're at a point where physical warfare is necessary to take over another nation.
Right.
China is, I mean,
agree.
other than, I guess you count Hong Kong or Taiwan maybe or something, but they never invaded anybody. Like, you have to look at what they're actually doing if you want to imagine that scenario. Cheeky mayor, because what would China do, like, if they wanted Switzerland? Like, Switzerland doesn't have a standing army. What would they do if they want South Africa? Like, they are doing it. They, like, go in there, they buy up whole ports and start shipping companies, and they send Chinese people over there to get citizenship and start a business and fund them and give them resources. And they give free classes in Mandarin to the police in Cape Town. Like, that's how China does it. And you can't say the South African army could fight off China. Like, they can't even keep the trucks running, So,
Right.
so if we were if America was anarchist, it seems more likely China would be trying to sell us laptops. Like they don't want to take us over. We'd just be another tax
they might
farm.
want to financially take us over, but without the centralization, it's actually difficult. Like, government centralize things. So when things are centralized, and they also give you monopolies, it's actually easier. Like, if China, let's just use Twitter as an example. Like, if China gets to do what they want on Twitter, and there's, like, right now a lot of people consider Twitter a near monopoly, right? I mean, there's other places that you can go, and we can have a separate argument about why that is with Twitter. But, like, if China controls the narrative on Twitter, well, that goes a long way to getting what they want. Like, they don't need to do anything else. I do want to say, though, I'm not of the mindset that an anarchist society, I think one of the problems that has happened in the US is that we do not jealously guard our liberties and our individual rights. We're not actually aggressive enough in defense of our liberties. And so I don't actually think that an anarchist society should, like, get out the mandolin and sing Kumbaya and not worry about, like, aggressive foreign actors. Like, I do think there needs to be the ability to retaliate and defend yourself, because there are evil governments, there are plenty of people in the world who would want to do you harm. And I think, for too long in the US, we haven't been guarding our liberties, and finally some people are going, hey, wait a minute, we've lost too many of them, but it's kind of too late. We should have been a lot more petty about guarding our liberties 200 years ago, right? And aggressive about it. because it would have been a lot easier. Now we're at this point where I'm not even sure what the right way to do it is, right? Because it's so far gone.
Separate.
Right. Separate, but you can't, but then you have to fight. You have to separate and be armed. Because you can't separate and then assume that they're going to leave you alone. We saw what happened with the
South.
War of Southern Independence or whatever you're calling it, Keith, right? Yeah, like
War for...
You can't separate and assume that they're going to leave you alone. You do actually have to. There's nothing wrong with violence, provided that it's in self-defense. In fact, it's moral when it's in self-defense. So you can't turn to like pacifism and hope that no one attacks you. Like, I don't think that works.
And that's the leftist anarchy version, right? It's the kumbaya version, which won't work. I don't think that will.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly. Yeah, maybe. They also seem to outlaw private property, so I can't.
Well, maybe they want an entire global version of that is the problem, because then the argument of national defense doesn't even matter, like, because everyone's doing it. The problem with that is that I don't think it's sustainable. I think a hierarchy is going to form.
Well, hierarchies do form, but hierarchies don't mean monopolies on force. Hierarchies are all over the place. Right? Every company has a hierarchy. Families have hierarchies. Like friend groups sometimes have hierarchies. Sports teams.
We see the competition buy out the competition all the time, taking more and more of the market share. So, that is self-regulating. It can't exist forever. I mean, the only monopolies that tend to exist have government sanction, because like either it exists and is good for people, like prices go low, like, you know, they have to keep their prices low to prevent competition from coming in. But you can always, like, competition does come in and things do change, right? Like, you can make that argument about, you know, one technology, and then 20 years later, there's a different technology that just makes the first technology obsolete. Like, things do change. So that the idea that, like, suddenly we're going to be under a monopoly because people are free, I think is more naive to think that it's going to happen in anarchy than with governments, because monopolies absolutely happen with government help. In fact, like, they happen faster and more easily with government help. That's why you have Zuckerberg begging for regulation. The barriers to entry for competing with someone like Facebook are government barriers to entry. Many of them, not all of them. But, like, this is how large corporations, if they have access, they will have resources. So if they have access to the monopoly on force through government contacts, don't think they won't use it. Like, of course they will. And they'll use it to get monopolies. So the best protection against monopolies is saying, actually, no one has monopoly on force. You can't. There is no authority you can go to make it illegal for your competitor to compete with you, or make it. You have to do X, Y, and Z in order to be able to enter the market or follow these regulations, or, like, you can't do that. So if you're actually worried about monopolies, government should scare you way more than anarchy. I don't know. I don't have that much trust in people, because
I don't either.
Either side of that, though, because I don't see that a company that forms a monopoly won't use the most unethical or dirty-handed tactics to take out their competition.
That's why you need force protection. So you're making the same point. It's impossible to have a monopoly without force. You can't have it.
But then,
and government is the normal way to do that.
But I mean, like, if a company has its force and they take more and more power, they merge with other companies, they buy other companies, some competition wants to form, and they go in and they kill them all. I don't see how that.
No one would do business with that company anymore. Like,
how do you have a choice if they became a monopoly? Like, if they got enough power.
It's only economic power, and you never let them get to that. Like, imagine trying to amass. If Zuckerberg started buying tanks and arming people, like, everyone would be like, fuck that. Like, people would get seriously scared, and they might start paying Gab to start building an army. Like, that's not, people don't put up with that. Like, you can't secretly build an arsenal and an army and then, like, march in magically and take over. That doesn't happen. You can't get away with it.
That sounds incredibly overt, but what if it's subterfuge? And then also, I think
What kind
you're
of subterfuge?
like, hiring an assassin or freaking setting off a poison in their,
Sure,
office. Like
I guess you could do all that, but you could do all that now. All of that could be done now. And it's easier now because you can bribe the government to do it in the light of day. Right? So, like, I would rather Zuckerberg have to poison or assassinate someone than bribe a senator, because bribing a senator is much lower risk. It's pretty easy to do, and he gets way better bang for the buck. If he has to actually go hire an assassin, I mean,
And by
I'd
the
like
way,
that to have to be his course of action, because someone will take him out if he gets caught.
you should keep in mind that the assassins that the government has are legal, quote unquote legal. So the government has assassins. If you're worried about assassins, that's the government. And they're not actually responsible for their assassination. In an anarchist society, the assassins wouldn't have protection of government. Try it as an experiment. Try to find a monopoly that doesn't have the government behind it. I've tried. I can't find one. Somebody said that once about 20 years ago to me, and I spent a year looking for one. There isn't one. Every time you think you found one, then you figure out there is one. And you see, what happens in a free society with competition is somebody comes along and does it better. I don't know if you probably don't remember AOL Messenger, but you remember Congress wanted to get involved. That's like a horrendous monopoly. We can't have. AOL's got an absolute monopoly. They have a stranglehold on the text messaging, computer to computer text messaging. And everybody's up in arms, and Congress is having meetings. We've got to do something about this monopoly. And Congress never actually did anything. And then texting of cell phones came out. Not that many people even remember AOL. Do you remember AOL Messenger? That was a monopoly that everybody was scared of. They were demanding the government get involved. But if you just wait,
Go ahead.
If you just wait a little bit, you can have a monopoly. Yeah, right. Rockefeller, the trains, the supposed. How did those monopolies?
Standard Oil. He did a great show about Standard Oil, and I'd
like to watch that and write that down.
He talks about the facts of it, and he's held up. Standard Oil is held up as this example of this horrible monopoly, and it's just not true. It's just not true.
It's not true.
Prices dropped. He massively. He paid his workers better than anyone else. It was great. It was great while it had large market share, which I think it got to 70% or something. But it did get to huge market share for a brief period of time. It wasn't a scourge. It wasn't this horrible thing that people had to deal with. And it happened
because it was a good idea.
Yeah, he started using oil to do stuff that other people weren't doing. He figured out better ways to use the byproducts and whatever, and started creating other things. And it wasn't just oil he was selling; it was other stuff. And it was it's the boogeyman of a free market monopoly is a creation. It's a myth, and it's mostly Hollywood's myths. But it's this myth. It's a leftist myth that the free market produces monopoly, and Mr. Burns sits at the top of it without any help from government and takes over. And I'm not saying that I know for certain. I'm 99.9% sure that would never happen in an anarchy society, but it happens now. I'm 100% certain that it happens now. So I'm not. Can we take the risk and be like, hey, it can't be worse. This is getting pretty bad, and America's been the best experiment we've got for a government, and it's still getting pretty bad. What's the harm in trying? Is the worst case we end up back in a situation with a government? All right, then we have this conversation again. Try something else.
I just assume government or no government, private or whatever, that power corrupts.
Power does corrupt, but the problem, I've run businesses. The problem with that is everyone thinks that the CEO of a business and the founder of a business is in this massive position of power, which in some sense they are. They do have economic power over, I guess, their employees or whatever, but not really. They need, you have to please your customers. The market is brutal. Competition is brutal. Innovation that like moves things forward is brutal. Like it's not actually easy to do a really consistent job of providing something that people voluntarily pay for over and over again and keep people happy that want to work for you and like all that. It's not an easy thing to do. So it's much easier to stand up and say, I'll give you free stuff if you vote for me. Like that's how the power mongers, the people who are like power hungry go into politics. They don't start companies. And if they do, they rarely succeed. Like the people who start companies, even if they're power hungry, their boss is the public, it's their customers. And if their customers don't like them, unless they buy a senator, they're fucked. Like they can't, there's no way out. You die. You die. If you don't make your customers happy, your business dies. If you don't make your employees happy, they move to Google or somewhere else. Like you're not a tyrant when you're head of a company. In fact, it often feels like you work for everyone else. That's what running a company psychologically often feels like the entire world is your boss. It often sucks. You're not in this catbird seat of being able to just do whatever you want willy-nilly, because everything you do has an effect. And if you don't constantly please your customers and your employees and everyone and your business partners and everyone else, like you fail. And business it's not easy to succeed. And I think the only people that look at business and say it's easy to succeed are people who've never done business. Like it's not easy. I don't like Mark Zuckerberg, but what he did is not easy. It's not easy to do that. It's extremely impressive. And it's rare that someone can pull that off.
I would never say that it's easy to succeed in business. That was never my stance ever.
Well, I guess my
Just to
point
be
is
clear.
you don't have like, you're not wielding this ton of power. There's not like a magic scepter, right? Even Elon Musk almost went bankrupt doing his, and by the way, he's in bed with government in many ways. Like, so he's not even a great free market example, but like people, it's not super easy to do. And it's not, I won't say it's easy because I know you're not saying easy. You're not a tyrant. You're not a dictator. Even if you own 100% of the shares and there's no board and it's just you're still not a dictator, because you can't get away with doing anything that you like if your competitor does a better job, you're dead. If they do a better job recruiting people, getting deals with partners, selling products, you're dead.
I do have a question about this though. So you're talking about business without state. I get that. Where does the standardized money come from? And this is a real practical question that I want to know.
I think that's a great question. I think one of the biggest enablers of government force is government monopoly on money, right? And they are, let's make no bones about it, like the banking system is in bed with the government, the oligarchs are in bed with the government. So you can't actually have a free market without free money, and we don't have free money. So, and I'm free money, I mean a free market in money. So I would say free market in money is whatever. If a bank wants to issue a currency, the bank issues the currency. Right now, what would happen in practicality is, at least in 2021, as I think you'd probably see a few different cryptos become semi-standard. Just like if you go to the store, you can use Apple Pay or this or that. You'd probably have a few different options for paying things, and people would take different currencies, and there'd probably be exchanges for different things. If you maybe high ticket items, were more Bitcoin and less Ethereum or whatever it was, and you had to do your exchange. But people would work it out. It's not like, do I know exactly what the currency would look like? No, but I know that it would be better, and it would be out of any central authority's control. So they couldn't just print it whenever they wanted, unless that was the currency that you chose, which I don't think would do well in the free market. But theoretically, I could say, I've got a printing press, I'm starting a currency, and try and convince people to use it. I don't think they would. But like, you would have pressure, right? And one point that the socialists in this book made, which I actually adamantly agree with, is the socialists are very upset about the price of labor, and they use this word that I hate all the time about the capitalist exploiting the labor workers, right? and there's a lot of resentment that comes through when they talk about it, and they use words like parvenu and stuff to be condescending towards people who've made money, right? But they made a really good point, and I forget who it was, but the point was actually because banks are not a free market, and because money is not a free market, it actually does distort the price of wages relative to interest rates for capital and resources. And so I think they're right, actually. I think there is, quote, exploitation in that sense built into the system because money is not a free market, right? And that's an area that I think I don't see the right really talk about a whole lot, but the leftists, these leftists anyway, these anarchist leftists that we're reading, they're 100% right about that. Because there's not a free market in money, it does actually have a negative impact on the difference between what a, quote, capitalist can do and get loans and buy capital versus the wage rates. The wage rates are that market is basically cleared, right? There's as much there's as much labor as people to join the labor force. Anyone can join the labor force. There's no barrier to entry. It drives wages right down to the edge of where they should be. But capital, that's not true. Capital is at a premium because it's controlled.
So essentially the same thing as like a company that had a company store and only paid you in that currency, you could only buy from them.
If you wanted, right? But
what I'm saying is that that's essentially a monopoly on currency. That's an example of it versus
Sure.
that being
Sure.
the only option for work, essentially.
Right.
But if you were to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 competitors with competitions for money, then you wouldn't necessarily have to use the money that by the people who are more exploitative, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I was actually talking about like banking, like having a bank is a monopoly, and like you can't, like, so interest rates are heavily controlled, and like nothing's free market. The rate at which money is lent out is not free market determined. So like that changes the calculation for the cost of labor versus the cost of capital, right? And I don't know what that would look like in a free market, but it very well might mean that capital is more expensive than labor compared to what it is now, and maybe you'd have more. I don't know what it would look like. But in the case where you have like companies issuing their own dollars, like I'm GE and I'm paying you in GE bucks, right? And Keith is Apple and he's paying you in Apple bucks. There'd probably be an exchange that was like an exchange rate between GE bucks and Apple bucks. And like, I don't think that kind of thing would last long because we're so interconnected as a society now that it would be annoying to everyone and no one would like it. And if Apple offered me a job and said like, you can come work for Alex's company, which issues this very standard, which pays you in Bitcoin, which everyone accepts, or you can work for Apple, which pays you in Apple bucks. I'd be like, screw Apple. I'm going to go work for Alex. So like, she's like, I don't want to have to deal with that, right? So like that, I don't think that the inconvenience wouldn't really last no matter how people, no matter how much tried to do that.
Or there would be like a third party. I mean, I just bought a t-shirt from the UK with PayPal. They converted my US dollars to euro or whatever it was that I paid for it, so you could have a third party provider who would be willing to do business with Apple bucks and GE, whatever, so.
Right.
Yeah, if I move to another country and I need to convert the money I'm making right now, there's someone to do that.
Right.
So it's not as if we don't have like an idea of exchange already.
Sure, and there's like a shit ton of cryptocurrency exchanges right now where like Dogecoin, which is a joke, can be used to do like, so you can do, anyone and their mother can come up with stuff.
If I were to invest in a cryptocurrency, it actually would be Dogecoin.
Would you do Doge? Well, the Shiba Inu it's a good logo. I just want to address something in chat. Ross says, capital is not free, but labor is. What do you get paid in seashells? I'm not sure what you're meaning there, but capital is less of a free market than labor. Labor is actually not a free market either because there's government intervention in unions and there's minimum wage and like a bunch of regulations about hiring people. So so labor's not completely a free market either. Capital is in no way a free market. Look at what's happening to any of these cryptocurrency companies who try and do anything. Like, they've got 5 different agencies, throwing people in jail, banging down their doors, telling them you can't do this, it's got to be regulated in that way, blah, 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 blah. You can't just start it. Like, Keith can't start a bank tomorrow without massive, massive government involvement and approval and everything else. So yeah, money is money is extremely controlled. Capital is
can't even run a small bank anymore. That's why the banks are consolidating, because the government, there's only a couple banks left, right? PNC buy up everything. If in a free market for money, I don't think the dollar would do very well. Like, that wouldn't take very long to fail. It's failing anyway, but like gold, there might be some gold exchanges and Bitcoin.
Someone
the
asked,
US dollar,
which is a bigger joke, Dogecoin or the US dollar, Keith?
I don't know.
But the way they print it, I would have to say the US dollar.
I would say the US dollar is a bigger joke. Yeah, I would.
Yeah, the US dollar, because I think, I don't know enough about Dogecoin to say, but the US dollar, they can just add more dollars anytime they want. And they have been. I don't think you can do that with Dogecoin, right?
No.
You can't. Dogecoin has a mining limit for every year.
Yeah,
So
it's the mining, and it's interesting, like Bitcoin, they use the word mine. It's like gold. So gold's a good one because it's hard to get, and you can't inflate. You can't have inflation very quickly. Inflation's limited because it's hard to get out. And by inflation, I mean increasing the money supply, the financial definition of inflation. You can't inflate the money supply very quickly with gold or Bitcoin or Dogecoin. They're artificially limiting it, but it is limited. They did come up with a method of limited. Dollar, we no longer have a limit ever since they went off the gold standard. So, what is the dollar worth? It's nothing. It's a promise. So it's the equivalent of, in an anarchist society, if I started a bank and I called it Keith Dollars, and I said, here's $1, just a piece of paper.
Well, the dollar's
just start exchanging them.
The dollar's backed by a promise to use force against the population of the United States in the future. That's what it's backed by.
So when they print more dollars, they're devaluing the current supply, and when you buy a bond, they promise to hold a gun to somebody who's probably not born yet head and get it back and give you your interest. Like, that's what it is. It's force. It's like the dollar is force, definitely.
Yeah.
It wouldn't exist. So anyway, my point was the dollar would fail pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It's interesting this kind of turned into more of
definitely it would be crypto. Like, it could be that we have you gold coins or gold, there's an argument to be made that crypto is, because it's not backed by anything, is ultimately doomed to fail as well. And I'm not trying to have that argument right now. All I'm saying is people would invent something, right? At the very least, you could probably pay in gold. Which I don't think
it's interesting that we talk about failures the Constitution not to follow, but like it says in the Constitution that the federal government is not allowed to make anything other than gold and silver coin money. Like, I don't actually know what the justification for going off the gold standard is, but it's unconstitutional. Like, they didn't want this fiat currency; they were against it. We don't follow. That's just another piece we don't follow. I had pulled up something when Alex, when you brought up the people thing, the problem, back to the anarchy. The people problem, the guy, it's a chapter 21, I forgot his name, but the attorney that was talking about, there's no such thing, the people are always in charge. He said, the fact is, there's no such thing as a government of law and not people. Law is an amalgam of contradictory rules and counter rules expressed in inherently vague language that can yield a legitimate legal argument for any desired conclusion. For this reason, as long as the law remains a state monopoly, it will always reflect the political ideology of those basically in power. So I think the point that you made about you're worried about power, and that's a reason to not want anarchy, like that's a reason to be scared of government too.
Oh,
argument
I
applies to
100%
government even
agree with
worse.
that. I 100% agree with that. I believe I don't want the government to have too much power either. So like on any level, like
Okay.
either. I mean,
So-
that's why I said at the
so-
beginning of this, a balance to me is best.
So the
By the way, someone
concept
in
that
chat
this guy
is-
brought up in the, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just
The
wanna address
concept that
this.
he brought up is that, let me finish this and then,
Yeah.
sorry with the delay. We're dealing with the Zoom delay, people. And trying to talk too much, I guess, me. The problem that I had never really occurred to me, because I was kind of always a rule of law guy. Like I spent 2 years working for convention of states trying to get the Constitution better. You always think, well, you need it's a government of law. We want to get back to a government of law. And his point, which I never heard before, is that there's no such thing. It's impossible to have a government of law because it's always people that administer it. And the laws, the vagueness of the laws and the ability of a decent lawyer to present a perfectly sound legal argument for any conclusion, like that's a lawyer's job, is to say, I'm the prosecutor, I'm the defense attorney, I'm a contract law, whatever, civil attorney. My job is to go find a legal argument for this case. So it's like a predefined conclusion, find a legal basis for it. It turns out a good lawyer can do that. It's no problem. A Supreme Court justice can do it using previous Supreme Court decisions. Like they can come to any conclusion they want.
Essay?
Yeah.
John Hasna's essay? The Myth of
I
the Rule
remember
of
the
Law?
name, yeah.
Okay, you did.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the one I'm quoting from.
Yeah, okay, just want to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the myth of the rule of law. So yeah, that quote was from that chapter. I forgot his name. I'm looking, I did it on Kindle, so I just have the highlights shown. It's just this chapter 21. What he's saying is that the flexibility of the law, like the interpretation, is a feature. And that astounded me. I went back and read that paragraph 3 times. Like, that's an interesting idea. It's a feature of law that it can be interpreted however you want. And the reason for that is because there's no such thing as a government of law or rule of law. It's always people. So there's always judges, there's always lawyers, there's politicians in charge, there's police, and it all goes back to people. That's an interesting argument for anarchy that I never heard before. And it's true. And you're bringing up the power, being scared of power a couple times. So the concept of the government has to do it because of this problem doesn't work. It actually makes it worse. In anarchy, like we've been talking a long time about national defense, that's a tough one. Most people, if you bring up the idea of, does the government have to do it? They bring up yeah, but what about roads? And I'll just remind them, well, the guys, they went to Philadelphia and wrote the Constitution. Like, federal government didn't have roads then. How did they get there? From South Carolina. They had roads. I got a little short story. Like when this first hit me, when I was like 19 and I moved to another state and I rented a house with a bunch of students going to college. And we're in the house and, our trash can was like filled up. And we're like, they won't get the trash. So remember, I like asked the neighbor, our trash, they're not getting our trash. And he's like, well, who's your trash company? I'm like, what do you mean trash company? I lived in New Jersey. They don't have such thing as a trash company. He goes, well, yeah, there's like a couple different ones. I use these, and he like rattled off 3 different companies that get your trash. And I'm like, what do you mean the government doesn't get your trash? Like I thought, and that like got me on this whole long thing. Like, does the government have to do this? So a lot of people, you have to start with the trash collection because they never heard of that. And I thought, well, this is crazy. This isn't going to work. We have to pay money. So then we like called up a trash company. We went with the cheapest one, a bunch of students. And it turns out like they came twice a week and you didn't have to put your can out to the curb. They like know your house because they go there twice a week. The guy they have this big burly guy. He's got a thing over his shoulder. Sorry about this story so long, but I like this as an anarchist example. He's got a big can over his shoulder and he goes into the back and the thing little scrawny guys like me were doing, we dump in the can. He just dumps the whole 3 days worth of trash in the thing and then goes to the next door. And when he's full, he goes out to the truck. like that's what happens when a private company does it. And I didn't check, but I bet they do it cheaper. We went the cheapest of the three, and people said, "Oh, I don't like those guys. You know, they don't put the lid back on the can." Like, I'm okay with that. So the reason I brought that point up is that when you start to talk about this idea, does the government have to do something? I don't think starting with national defense is a good tactic with most people. Trash collection in the roads might be an easier one. Money's kind of in between. Like, do you really have to have a monopoly of money?
I do have a
And for
question
me, this whole process, go ahead.
on the, like, if you're talking about different levels, like, what about local force? Like, I walk down the street here in Phoenix, and one of the reasons why I'm not attacked is because a police car drives up and down this street regularly. It's a deterrent. Not necessarily are they arresting anyone or shooting anyone, but just seeing them as a presence with their, police sign and everything. And I pay taxes to get that. Either way, I would have to pay privately. Either way, I'm paying for it, like if it's private or not, but it's distributed.
Yeah,
If it's
I would
taxes,
argue that a better defense is that enough people are armed, as far as that one goes. In a private society, you would have some security driving around. So you see a place like
There
New
are,
York,
by the way, there
like,
is
really
private
dropped the
security
comment.
in communities. We have, our community has a private truck that drives.
Your
I don't
stuff?
think the guy does anything but drive around with a label on the side to deter crime. It's part of the HOA fee, and I'm not even part of the HOA, but like, I'm like near the rest of the HOA people, and so drives around.
I
Drives around
think
way
you
more
might
than the
find.
cops do.
Well, here's an example. We were just at the Free State Project in the campground in New Hampshire. So, like, they don't want the police in there. New Hampshire's an open carry state. So, yeah, there's guys walking around with the AR-15 over their shoulder and open carrying sidearms, like, all over the place. Like, you don't need a cop. And they did have security, but I never saw them. They didn't have a car. Anybody that meant harm in that place, you'd walk in, like, and 5 minutes later turn around and leave. So I think the concept of private people having arms provides that protection at least as much as security. A security guy, a lot of them aren't armed, and that's good enough. All you need is like somebody with eyes and a camera and a cell phone to call the guy with the gun. That does perfectly fine security in a lot of cases. So I would argue, I don't think it's the police. It's certainly not the government. You don't need the government for that. And there's examples everywhere. And in the United States, I don't think it is the government that's deterring it. It isn't here. Florida, there's over 2 million people have concealed carry permits in Florida. So
then
a lot of people say, like,
how do you
go ahead.
account for the fact that in cities where they've defunded the police, crime went up?
Because they also didn't allow other citizens to have guns.
Yeah, what
I mean,
city allows
Chicago
Where
is
did they do that? Chicago, Portland,
Yeah,
Minneapolis.
Chicago,
That's where they did that.
I'll
Guess
be
what? They're
driving
not doing that in Orlando or Miami. You're doing that in Miami, I can tell you that. Half the
But
people walking down the street have a gun in their purse.
They're
wouldn't
one
work in
vote
Miami.
away from doing it in Phoenix. One city council vote away from doing it. And why Arizona has extremely liberal gun laws, Phoenix doesn't.
Maybe
You
it won't
carry-
matter there.
I used to carry in
Interesting.
Arizona. You can do open carry. I think I had an Arizona permit as well. But can you carry into Phoenix? I don't remember.
You can, but also you're probably not going to be very successful at it. Like, you're going to be stopped. You're going to be molested by the police, which I find, like, I'm not saying I'm
You're paying for that too.
Yeah, exactly. See, that's the thing. I'm literally asking you guys what you think, not because I'm trying to make a point. So just to be clear, I'm not doing that subtly or whatever. I really wanted to know your opinions on these things.
Well, I happen to live in a town that doesn't have police, so I don't know. We don't have police. There's no police here. We'd have to call the sheriff and a deputy would come, but you don't see him very often. In Florida, I know more about Florida, but I can compare like Florida to New Jersey, or compare the United States to the UK. In Florida, I have a friend that's a private investigator, and he also did investigation for the county. Like in Florida, people don't break into homes at night when people are home, and that's pretty much true everywhere in the United States. Like that don't happen. So like one stat, I don't recall the numbers, but it's somewhere like it's rare, 5% or something. It's very rare. Most home break-ins in the United States happen between like 10 and 2 p.m. Like that's when people break into houses in the United States. In the UK, it's the opposite. The most common time to break into a house is like 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. People are sitting in a living room because nobody has a gun. So that's a good time. You break in, you get their jewelry, you ask them where their money's stashed, tie them up. Like that's when people break in places like that. So I think it's a combination. So a place that observes the right to keep and bear arms, which is certainly a tenet of anarchist society, I don't think you'd have that problem walking down the street, because somebody that tried to jump you, unless you're completely alone and no one else around, the more people around, the better off you are. And people around here say that all the time. I live in a place where a total stranger sitting in a bar, you chatting with a half an hour, and he'll just casually mention he's got a Glock on him. Like that don't happen in New Jersey, but in Florida, I doubt it's possible to go into a restaurant where I live and not have somebody in there armed. Probably never happens unless it's a tiny place or a grocery store. Like I'm not worried about a mass shooting in a grocery store. Some old lady will pull a 45 out of her purse. That's the culture.
Guys, we've gone for
of New Jersey.
2.5 hours. I think maybe we should wrap it up. Does anyone have any final thoughts on this book? Since
I was going to ask you if because I think you're the best one I know that's equipped to do it. What would be your is it possible? And if so, could you give a 2-minute pitch for anarchy?
Is it possible?
How would you do that? If it's possible.
Well, yeah.
If it is,
of course it's possible. I don't even understand the question. Get rid of
if somebody said, that'll never work, and you had a short time to tell them, what would you say? I'm not sure what I would say. I'm just getting to this.
Yeah, I know. I think the major point I would make is you're not going to convince someone in 2 minutes, but I think I would say, look, stop comparing it to a utopian ideal of what you think a limited government minarchist state would be, and compare it to what we have now. And now doesn't work. And we definitely know, I mean, most people who would talk to me about this are not statists. So they're people who at least want to move, in a minarchy or libertarian direction. And usually my answer is actually, I'm on board with let's do your thing first. I'm okay with that. Let's do your thing first. I'm happy to let's be on a trajectory together to see how small we can make government. Right? And if you win, and if we get down to the point where we've got national defense and some other thing and it's that small and we still can't convince people that could be also taken over, I mean, I feel like I've done a pretty good job. That's okay. So instead of, people push back on this idea it can't possibly work. It's well, we live in a state of anarchy normally with each other. As Michael Malice would say, anarchy is a relationship. So we don't need a government. We don't need to have a third party interfering with our interaction. I'm not afraid. If we were in person, obviously we're online right now, but I wouldn't be afraid that suddenly Alex would strangle me. Alex isn't going to strangle me. I don't need a third party to make sure that Alex doesn't strangle me and tax us both so that Alex doesn't strangle me. I'm not going to strangle Alex. She's not going to strangle me. Mostly we exist in a relationship of anarchy to one another, which is just voluntary agreement. We just voluntarily want to have a conversation. We don't wish each other harm. Like, that's the end. And most of our relationships are relationships of anarchy, right? Where we don't have a third party mediating the relationship. And so, I don't know that there's a silver bullet to like, this is why anarchy would work. And one of the problems, and this is the thing, I'll paraphrase this because I couldn't find the quote I was looking for, but it was earlier in the conversation. I said Beverly gets mad at me when I say this, but this is the issue. Whenever anyone says, how would X, Y, and Z work in a free market? My answer to that is, you're missing the point. If I could explain how X, Y, and Z would work in a free market, then one person could conceptualize how a thing could work in a free market and implement it. Therefore, I could be a central planner. Therefore, we might as well just central plan it. The whole point of a free market is we don't know, but it always turns out better because what we do know is that you can't centrally plan the lives of 330 million people just in the US. You can't centrally plan their lives and figure out exactly what their preferences are and their desires and what they value more than one thing over another, what prices should be. Like, you can't actually plan any of that centrally. You need people voluntarily interacting, coming up with their own ways of being, and you have multiple solutions usually to the same problem because different people want different things. That's how it would work. And that's the kind of stock answer for everything. How would roads work? I don't know. I shouldn't know how roads would work. I know they can. I've been to places where there are toll roads that have little things that, when you drive on a thing, it tracks where you are. And like, that's one way. I've also been to communities where private residence communities where they all chip in and pay for the road in front of their house because that's what they want. Like, I don't know. I don't know how it would work. But the point is, not knowing how it will work, that is the point. You're not supposed to know how it works. But what I do know is that nothing gives you the right to force anyone else to do anything at gunpoint. And just because you vector through voting and add a patina of legitimacy to it doesn't mean that you're not still forcing someone at gunpoint to do what you want. So for me, it's just basically a moral question. It's, you have a right to exist. You have a right to not be aggressed upon. And if that's the goal in creating a society, you necessarily start to look towards libertarianism and minarchy. And I don't even think it's really worth arguing the difference between minarchism and anarchy until we're at minarchism, because right now you need a license to be a barber. So we're way too far away from anything resembling a free market. And by the way,
All right.
I don't care if people agree with me. You're allowed to not agree in a free market and go start a commune in a free market. Like, that's cool. I'm really just looking for people who want to be left alone. So, and voluntarily interact, not alone. Voluntarily interact. So, all right. That was too long and it wasn't even a great answer. Sorry.
No, but it's a good. Thanks. And I've never tried to do that. I've never tried to argue for anarchy. I didn't know enough to ever try, but I definitely get your point about moving in that direction. Like I said in the beginning, I've been moving that way my entire adult life. And I'm far more familiar with presenting a, kind of small L libertarian sort of government to a staunch Republican conservative. The government needs to run this, that, and the other thing, but not these other things. And liberal, it's the same argument to me. They just have a different list of things they want to run, but they agree on, we have to borrow $4 trillion a year and we have to run your life in these ways, but not these other ways. And it's a secondary thing when you talk about, okay, well, we want to control your social life, but not your economic life or whatever. However you want to, I don't actually care about that part. It doesn't even make any difference to me which one I'm talking to present a libertarian.
I find the moral.
So you have to do that first.
Straightforward.
So yeah. So my question was really, and I didn't ask it completely, but I was thinking more like, okay, you got a guy that's a staunch small L libertarian. How do you get him to the next step? you know,
I think
how are you
agree with
going
him
to
100%
be
to
explaining?
go to small L libertarian first, and then you argue. And you're like,
Yeah,
look,
once they're
we're not
already
doing
there.
roads, we're not doing healthcare, we're not doing barbers. Look at all this stuff we're not doing. You know what? Let's not do fire. Let's have fire insurance be private. Okay, great. Now, hey, how about we not do this area of policing? Okay, awesome. Like
Mhm.
you move them incrementally, and I think it's radical ideas are they're by their nature are too far removed from where we are for people to wrap their head around the possibility that they could happen, right? And there is some rational fear about crazy radical ideas, because sometimes when people have radical crazy revolutions, you end up with Stalin, right? Like often you end up with some, like, you know, you had plenty of examples in the 20th century and beforehand where you ended up with just horrific governments that were built on some sort of ideal. And I would argue that the problem isn't ideals, the problem is bad ones. Like if bad ideas do lead to bad governments. So anyway, can we do? I just want to read a couple super chats really quickly. Brian says, any thoughts about the dual legal systems instituted through Sharia courts within England over the last decade? I don't know anything about it. Do you guys? No.
Yeah, there's areas in England where there's communities of immigrants, Muslim immigrants that are now UK citizens that the police don't go in. They're implementing their own government within England. Now, whether or not you want to let that happen, but yeah, there's parts of London, and I've heard that. I don't know the details. From an anarchist perspective, that's fine. Now, I don't know if the people of England want to allow that. And the Sharia law version of it, you just say, well, that's not what I would want. I wouldn't want to live in that area. If you put a wall around them and they just kept to themselves, I guess I would say leave them alone, as horrible as it is. If I knew somebody to live there, I might help them get out if I was allowed to go in. I think it's bad, but if that's what they want to do, and England seems to be okay with that, I don't know why. I don't understand that. But I mean, this is part of why Brexit happened. You know, that's like the number one reason Brexit has happened.
But I assume that not everyone in there wants to be part of that, right? Like, if I were in a district, I would want to be able to appeal to the UK government and say, guys, I don't want to go to Sharia court. I guess I could choose.
I was thinking.
Can you choose like going to arbitration, or like is it just like, no, you're on your own, you're in this area and you're going to Sharia court?
I don't know that detail, but I have read about areas where the police pretty much don't go in, communities. So, you know, the next step from that would be this other step. But I don't know, I'm not aware of any that have any kind of restriction on leaving. Like a Muslim living in those areas, it is still England. They're UK citizens. They could move out of that area.
Is a pretty bad argument, right? Like, because you shouldn't have to leave. Like, you can't say like, I'll stop. Like, if I just start beating you up in your house and be like, well, you could leave, you could move. It's like, well, yeah, you could, but you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to move to have your rights not violated. So if England is going to pretend to care about individual rights, I don't think they can take that stance. But I don't know the extent that they even cared about individual rights anyway. So
it's a conflict, I think, from what I understand of it. And again, I'm no expert in this. I've just read a little bit about what's going on.
My question on that is, what if the violation is that someone isn't letting you leave? Then where do you go?
Yeah, I mean,
I agree that leaving is a bad approach. If someone's not letting you leave, you got to shoot your way out, I guess. I'm not saying it's good, and believe me, I'm not defending this. I'm just thinking through it from an anarchist society. Carter's brought it up many times. I think it's a great argument that in a free society, people are allowed to form a little Sharia law community and just leave them alone. If their culture wants that, UK has this conflict, and this goes back more to the unsafe space kind of thing. That they've got this big conflict between their point system. So, okay, their government is about freedom, free society, can't harm others, and you're not allowed to say anything about somebody else's culture. So they've got this conflict where, well, they say that's their culture, that you know, cut off the arm of a thief or whatever. I exaggerated. I don't know if they're doing that or not, but it's a conflict for them, and they're going to have to work through it. So I think the first time, you know, they put somebody to death for sleeping with somebody else's wife, say, or, you know, I don't know, maybe that'll kind of fall apart. They are still inside the UK.
Ross in chat says only mutual agreed family law in England is not okay with it. So look, if it's you can choose a different mediator through different rules and you both agree, like I don't see the problem. All right, I'll Fight You Naked says, isn't China taking over large parts of Africa just by economic power? Yes. The answer to that is very short. Yes, they are. They are indeed. But Africa has been kept down predominantly by the way that foreign aid is distributed. Like a lot of these warlords and problems in Africa, I mean, a lot of it can be traced to do-gooders in the West shipping money to warlords. So,
and one point to make on that, the way that they start, the way they do it is they start by sending money. So it is economic. Yeah. So like the president of South Africa might have a new mansion and 2 more wives on the side because of funding from China. Like that's how they start. And then they buy a shipyard, and then all the imports for an area are through China. This is what they're doing. I happen to know about South Africa. That is what they're doing. And like the next step I think I mentioned earlier, teach them Mandarin for free. Like if they come here and start that program, I hope people will object.
A lot of people in Africa are welcoming the Chinese. Just to be clear, I mean, maybe it's hard to imagine, but this is how bad life is there. Like my wife's friend was getting, I guess this was going around on the internet in China, whatever. Like there's constantly people sending videos from Africa, like Africans sending videos back to Chinese companies and people that are involved, like thanking them for being involved, speaking in Mandarin, like showing that they've learned Mandarin, like they are happy that China is doing that.
And you know, the government of South Africa is pretty bad. Like they might, I don't want the government of China to take over, but they're probably better than the ANC, the African National Congress. They probably are better. Like they'd be better off in China. You know, I know people in South Africa. They're in a horrible state. They'd be better off in China, I think. Pretty sure, actually, they'd be better off in China. It's safer. They could start a business and run it without a problem. They wouldn't be scared to stop at a red light at night. Probably that's not a problem in China.
No. China's actually quite
so yeah, people might welcome it. And like we were talking about, what would China do here? No, they're not doing it with nuclear missiles, even though they could. They didn't need to do that. When's the last time China invaded a country? I can't think of one. Not counting.
They haven't even invaded Taiwan yet.
Taiwan and
yeah.
All right. I guess we should wrap it up, guys. It's been a while. Thank you for joining me, all 3 of you. I don't know if Cheeky's still there. You still there, Cheeky?
I am still here. You can't see me.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining as well. Thanks everyone for watching. Let's see. We have Coffee break tomorrow morning. So we'll see you for that. And I don't know. Other than that, have a good rest of the day. Let's hope that this works. Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, We have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms. Well, mostly. And you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to its thinky talk. The following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and will be recycled as part of our sustainability program. Here's a fun fact: there is literally no downside to unreserved obedience. We are not violent, but I would like to remind you that we have nukes and F-15s. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.